Hello, my fellow Westorians. Welcome back to the last, for a little while, episode of Valar Rereadis for the World of Ice and Fire. We're going to be getting House of the Dragon coverage shortly, and we've finished off these last few weeks of Valar Rereadis with some dragon-y topics. We had Dragonstone, we had the free city of Lys, all three of those cities we covered. And now, today, we have King Daeron I, the young dragon. Very young indeed, and didn't reign for very long, but it was a very interesting and tumultuous reign that comes after a period we're about to get very familiar with. This is post Dance of the Dragons era, about 26 years after the dance ended. King Daeron took the throne, or ascended to the throne. He didn't take it. He was next in line. There was no shenanigans. And he was born in 243, or 143, so 12 years after the dance. So, yeah, a very, very interesting figure. We're going to talk about it. We're going to have fun. Sean, what did you bring to drink today while you talk about the young dragon?
Well, actually, I'll talk about my drink, but I had a quick question about the young dragon. Was he called the young dragon in his own time, and that's where the young wolf came from for Robb, or do we call him the young dragon now because Robb was called the young wolf?
Good question. Well, we have... I don't know if he was called the young dragon in his time. That's a great question. We don't know a lot about him as a person. We know a lot about what he did, but one of the topics we have today is that it's sort of like Aegon the Conqueror, who was called Aegon the Dragon, and Daeron was also called Daeron the Dragon, or the Young Dragon, because they were similar in a lot of ways, not in lifespan. And, of course, Daeron had no dragons, but Young Dragon, he's sort of like the one that was most like him, right? So, yeah, we really don't know if people called him that during his life. I think so. I would guess yes. If I had to, since you're asking, I'm going to guess yes, but it's not confirmed. We don't have. It's possible it's something we could determine, but right now I'm not sure.
Don't get me wrong. I'm excited to talk about my drink, but I wonder if someone in there in the chat can like find the first instance of when he was called the young dragon in the text.
Well, he was,
and what was
the first appearance of his name is in Jon's first chapter in Game of Thrones. He comes up right away
But was he called the young dragon?
Yeah, but that was but that's long after he was dead. We still don't know if he was called that while he was alive.
But still, before anyone would have called Robb the young wolf.
Oh yes, because absolutely, that's one of the last things we'll talk about is how well Robb's career parallels Daeron's, and it was in fact the first real catch for our Parallel Live series. It was the one that started it all. We've done a lot of those Parallel Lives tweets, and we did an episode on it, and we love to do that sort of comparison. That was the first one for me.
Another thing you said in there that I know is going to end up happening, I assume is going to end up happening through the course of this, but the idea that we don't necessarily know a lot about him as a person or his character, but I think we can construe a lot from the details that we do. I mean, we're not necessarily right. We can't be sure, but I think we can make some decent assumptions.
Absolutely.
Which I imagine a lot of the characters in House of the Dragon, that's going to be the scenario. That we know like names and dates from what Martin wrote, but this show is going to be able to somewhat fill in, however accurately in George's mind, the personalities and the emotions and such behind those names and dates. But anyway.
Right on.
I've got the Blue Mountain Dew.
Mountain Dew.
Yes, which I don't find as often, but when I do, I always get it because it's my favorite one. Along with the standard berry protein naked drink and Bang, the raspberry Bang, which goes well with the Blue Mountain Dew, which is also very
raspberry
flavored.
Bang blue?
The Bangs are all almost all the Bangs are clear. They're just completely clear. I think they have like some chocolate flavors and some tea flavors that might have color. If I had them, I don't remember what the colors were. But all the like the berry or the mango, whatever, they're all just completely clear. So.
These people need to start sponsoring us.
They already got Nathan Fielder sponsoring.
I know. You're pitching their stuff for free here. You're becoming an advocate. Anyway, so grab yourself a tasty beverage, folks. We've got plenty to talk about today. Shout out to our friend Nina, Good Queen Alley with 1L.tumblr.com. That's her blog. She is her current most latest post is on Targaryen names. Daemon, Daeron, Aegon. Names like Aegon. I usually, some people say Aegon. I don't usually do that, but it came out that way just now.
She's doing an article on all 5 Targaryen names.
That's ridiculous, Sean. There's 6. No. So, well, we have more to say about that in a minute, but let's get through the rest of our intro process here. And one of those amazing things that we have to talk about today in our intro process that we don't normally have to talk about is that we're going to Santa Fe this current week, to watch the new episode of House of the Dragon, the first episode, a little bit early at George R. R. Martin's theater, and we're going to interview him right before the episode. So he should be in a really good mood right before the episode. So hopefully that goes really well. We hope to if we can do half as well as Game of Thrones did with their interview, we'll be doing a good job. But we're gonna approach things a little differently, but hope to get a similar quality finished product from that. But I'm sure it'll be good because George is going to be talking, and there's no the bar is pretty low for that. If George is talking, you're going to have a good time.
But that does mean that we'll be asking some fan submitted questions. The interview is on August 18th. So if you're listening to this after August 18th, it's too late. But if you're listening to it before August 18th, you can go to the Facebook group or our Discord or to Twitter and reply to the tweet or the post and give us your question.
Yeah, and if your question gets asked, we'll read your name out loud. So you get your name read to George, and then it'll be on the episode. So most of the questions will come from us, but the best questions from y'all we'll get in there as well.
And George is going to let you ask about 86,000 questions, so you'll be able to get them all in, right?
That's correct. Our plan is to kidnap him and take him off to, like a misery type situation where we chain him to a typewriter. And it's
he's
standard.
Either going to be writing wins or answering questions, and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. So you can listen to that interview when it's published, as well as the rest of our episodes, our full catalog, minus the bonus episodes, which are behind a paywall. But all of our free episodes are on Spotify, Google Play, Amazon Music, and on Patreon. You can get the bonus episodes there, and you can also get them on Spotify by becoming a paid subscriber of History of Westeros. And you can go to our website, historyofwesteros.com, which can do things for you like take you directly to a specific chapter in Valar Rereadis via YouTube. So we've got all sorts of great ways to consume our content. And if you want to participate, not only can you ask questions potentially to George through us, but you can ask us questions in all of our live streams, either during or before. You can join us on Discord or Facebook to submit questions ahead of time, or Patreon, or send us an email. Or if you're in the live chat, you can post them in the comments there, and Ashea will hopefully see it, and we'll get to it. Our question to you, as always, is the trivia question we start with. I do want some feedback on these. Are these questions too hard? I know they're hard. I make them hard on purpose, but are they too hard? I don't know if people mind. Like, sometimes if the question's too hard, I don't know if that's a problem. But yeah, weigh in. No, so far no one's told me that, but I'll go ahead and ask. If they're too hard, let me know, and I'll try to do it a little differently.
I would say they're definitely too hard for the average person, even the average fan, but not for our average viewer.
Yeah, that's what I'm aiming for. I want them to be difficult, but maybe if they're too
I think
difficult,
someone's gotten it correct every time so far, so that's an indication that it's not too hard.
I thought there were a few people didn't get, but maybe not. All right, let's see how this one
I might be misremembering.
We know the names of 2 of King Daeron I's Kingsguard. One of them is the very famous Aemon the Dragonknight. Who is the other? We know his full name and his nickname, so give yourself credit if you get either, and double credit if you know both his name and his nickname. Hint: a POV character who shares this man's house thinks of seeing today's answers death memorialized on tapestries back home where they came from. That was part of why I was asking if they're too hard, if I should start giving a little more hint here and there, because I don't think that gives it away, but it might get you on the right track. So I'll try to get better.
That hint might be too hard.
Yeah, it might make it harder. I don't know. Anyway.
That could be its own trivia question.
It narrows it down to a POV character's house. That helps. That should help a lot. It's not house, Wild or, there's lots of other houses that don't have POVs. It's not a Frey. I don't think there's been a Frey Kingsguard anyway, but maybe there is. A lot of unknown Kingsguard. There could have been a Frey Kingsguard.
That hint also reveals it's a man.
That's true. That's true. That's true. Something that really excites me about this topic, and Sean, you kind of touched on this a little bit about the unknownness of this topic, about the unknownness of this character. Unknownness isn't a word, but I just used it, and you knew what I meant.
It is now. Yep.
And it's exciting because of the hugely positive direction the Game of Thrones franchise is going. We know enough on this character to do a big episode. We have a particularly long document today, and we always have a long document. That's what she said. But there's a lot of missing detail, a lot of open mysteries. Example, the one we started with. We don't know his personality very well. He was the last Targaryen to wield Blackfire in combat that we know of. That's kind of cool. He's not the last one to have it. Aegon IV had it. After all, he gave it to Daemon Waters, who became Daemon Blackfire. But we're pretty sure Aegon IV never fought with Blackfire. He just held on to it and kept looking fancy. So Daeron I, yeah, he is a lot like Aegon the Conqueror. Shorter lived, hidden personality, similar nickname, very capable, very confident, very driven. But what drove him? What did he think needed doing? Why did he think it was important? Was it just like teenage verve? You know, he's like, I'm going to go conquer something, or I got to go be violent. I don't know, but it could just be that, but there might be more to it. Maybe he had some dreams. Maybe the dreams of the Conqueror were passed down. Maybe something he read in a book. Maybe he read the same book Rhaegar read. Who knows? That's a big open mystery. And if this ever hits TV, and I think it could, because it's a great story. It's a really interesting, compelling time period. This detail would have to be filled in.
You know, I appreciate that you drew the Rhaegar parallel, because if I understand right, his character wasn't really a warmonger. He ended up training to be a warrior. He kind of recognized it was part of his role in leadership or whatever.
Yeah.
Could be something similar with Daeron, right? Yeah. He might not have necessarily wanted to go to war, but he might have realized on some level it might be better for the stability of the kingdom. You know, he might have had someone whispering in his ear. All kinds of factors.
Yeah, whispering in your ear. I think that's a big one. I mean, and I think we're gonna get to some, not evidence of that, but the suggestion of that possibility during the episode. Another really big.
Never mind a dragon dream.
Yeah,
by the way,
absolutely
too, right? So,
and I'm glad you mentioned that too, because dragon dreams, most of the dragon dreams we know of happened after the dragons were gone. And it definitely happened before that. Definitely. Although maybe they weren't dragon dreams, they were just dreams, prophetic dreams. Like Daenerys the Dreamer, her dream about the Doom, obviously that happened while there were still dragons around. There were still Valyria around when that happened. There was a lot of dragons. But most of the dreamers were post-dragon era. And of course, that's also, we have better records of this time. Still, one of the other compelling things here is Daeron broke the Iron Throne's promise. Aegon the Conqueror, for whatever reason, and this is a long-term mystery that maybe one day we'll get deeper into or get clarity on, he backed down from Dorne. He's like, they had their war, Dorne brought him a letter, Aegon read the letter, got really mad, flew off to Dragonstone, came back and said, okay, we're not attacking Dorne anymore, ever again. He says, permanent peace. And that peace held, minus some raiding back and forth, little stuff that you wouldn't call the fault of the Iron Throne, just individuals doing stuff. But Daeron absolutely broke this promise, this pledge that his ancestor made to permanent peace with Dorne. So it's not just I'm going to attack Dorne. He broke this promise. So there's
another parallel to Robb.
Maybe, yeah. That's true. So we'll have to think about that and keep our eye out for ideas. We don't have an answer, but it's a worthy theorizing. We know a lot more about the second Daeron, who brought Dorne into the realm peacefully via marriage, rather than this way. But without Daeron I starting it all up again, confusing the issue, bringing it back to the front, what happened with Daeron II may not have happened. There may not have been an impetus to become peaceful. It may have just been two independent kingdoms still at that point. But because all this happened, and because there were promises broken and hostilities really bad on both sides, there was a need for peace. And, well, that's what happened later. And we know a lot more about Daeron II, partly because his kingship takes place during the Blackfire and Dunk and Egg eras, which we just have a lot more on.
I was about to ask how much farther. How much longer was that? Like 100 years?
No, not even. Okay, so Daeron I took the throne and became king. I said that again. Took the throne. Ascended in 157. He was the heir. And Daeron II ascended in, was it 182 or 184? I forget. I always get those two mixed up. One of them is when he knighted. I think it was 184. 184. So and then.
So not like 100 years, but well more than one generation. It was.
Yeah, it was about two. Yeah, there were two kings in between Daeron and Daeron, but one of the kings was only for 1 year. It was Aegon the Unworthy, mostly his reign, and then his dad Viserys reigned for 1 year. Viserys II. So something that they have in common, apart from name, the Daerons, is that they were both dragonless, and they also will know a lot more about them when Fire and Blood 2 comes out. At which point, quite a few topics we've covered will be worth supplementing, if not entirely revisiting. So that's what excites me at this topic, is we have so much to say about this topic, and we haven't even seen the up-close version of it when it's chronicled in more detail by the sources who were there, like a Gildane or someone who he borrowed from, rather than Eandel, who will be writing about the events far later and was doing more of an overview of times like this. He didn't focus on the Targaryens as much as Fire and Blood does. So that's awesome. So thinking of everything we have looked forward to really makes me feel lucky. I hope you do too. We're on the cusp of much bigger things, and the future looks bright. First mentions. Let's do that like we usually do. The first mention in the world of Ice and Fire itself comes during the reign of Daeron's father, Aegon III, the Dragonbane.
It was a broken reign that followed, for Aegon himself was broken. He was melancholy to the end of his days, found pleasure in almost nothing, and locked himself in his chambers to brood for days on end. He likewise came to dislike being touched, even by the hand of his beautiful queen. Even after she flowered, he was long in calling her to his bed, but ultimately their marriage was blessed with 2 sons and 3 daughters. The eldest, Daeron, was named the Prince of Dragonstone and heir apparent.
So that's another just complete hole for us. We have no idea the relationship between Aegon III and his firstborn Daeron. And, well, Aegon was a very traumatized king. He was not a happy person. He had a lot of things go terribly for him. Saw a lot of awful things during the dance. Things that we'll see on screen. But so this maybe is a response. Maybe Daeron is so full of energy and ambition just in part because his father so wasn't. He is a lot. You see that a lot of times where when a parent or older sibling is an extreme personality, that maybe their next sibling or another member of the family comes out somewhat opposite. I don't know why that happens, but it does happen. Yeah, Tommen. Perfect example, Sean. That's a fantastic example.
Well, Tommen is good, but I actually said Tywin.
Tywin, his father, Tydos, yeah. But
You're right. Okay, both
Tommen
examples are great. Tywin and Tommen. Tommen super different than his real parents and his older brother, and Tywin very different than Tytos. Yeah, hugely different than Tytos.
Different than, we'll say Tommen is different than his biological parents, but also the father that, quote unquote, raised him too.
Yeah,
right?
Very true. Yeah, he's also different than Robert. Yeah, and although Robert, like you said in quotes, Robert didn't really raise him. Yeah. But he was he was an influence.
But you could still,
he was still a father figure.
Yeah.
So Nina points out it's a little odd that Eandel says Aegon III was, quote, long in calling Daenerys to his bed, given that Daenerys was only 15 or 16 when Daeron was born. This is maybe less a reflection of Daenerys' actual age and more a comment on the length of time she had been queen. They were betrothed when she was like 6. On the other hand, it could be this maester is confused why he's not bothered by her age as a thing. Like we would be like, that's too young. But in this setting, of course, clearly that's not a problem for them. So he's like, why didn't he hook up with his hot wife when he could? Like what's stopping him?
She was already 13. Come on.
Yeah, I feel like that's what this is, what's being said here. So it's like, ugh. But Aegon's also just highly traumatized. Like, he's not into being touched. That's what it says there. I mean, this maester, Yandel doesn't understand trauma, and it's a big part of it. He also doesn't understand. He's a maester, hasn't had a lot of relationships of his own. So he just, from his perspective, he's like, I would do anything to be with a girl. I'm just stuck here with these books all day. You know, there's no women around. So yeah, maybe that's why he doesn't get it. But also, there wasn't a lot of need for Aegon III to have children. He did, and it was a good thing, I suppose. But he had his brother Viserys, and as we talked about last week, Viserys became married to Lara Rogare, who he was very into, and they had kids. And they already had kids. Their kids came first. So the future Aegon IV, Nerys, and Aemon the Dragonknight, who will have a pretty big role this episode. So when Daeron was born in 143, House Targaryen was not in danger of dying out or anything. Despite all the deaths during the dance, there were a good number of Targaryens left, and they were rebuilding. They were back to a healthy number of princes and princesses where you could have some tragedy, several dying at once, and there would still be quite a few left. And of course, there were no dragons. Well, actually, there were a few, but none that could fight or intimidate anyone. And that's an important mention for the setting here in this nearly post-dragonless world. So the first mention, as I said in the intro, as Sean was asking some good questions there, is Jon 1, A Game of Thrones. Comes up super early, his first chapter, early mention. Definitely look at this as foreshadowing. Here's the quote.
Daeron Targaryen was only 14 when he conquered Dorne, Jon said. The young dragon was one of his heroes.
A conquest that lasted a summer, his uncle pointed out. Your boy king lost 10,000 men taking the place and another 50 trying to hold it. Someone should have told him that war isn't a game. He took another sip of wine. Also, he said, wiping his mouth, Daeron Targaryen was only 18 when he died. Or have you forgotten that part?
Jon's response is, I forget nothing. He's drunk and mad that he's in the back, and he's surly and watching all the other people go and sit at the high table, and he's pretending it doesn't bother him, and Benjen knows otherwise. So it's pretty cool. It's a great comment, and it's really early. Like I said, first chapter, like one of the first things he does. And yeah, Daeron Targaryen absolutely being set up not just as a parallel to Robb, but as a parallel to Jon. I mean, Jon also gets killed at 18 and Robb, and leads a lot of men, especially Robb more so than Jon, leading the men to their death. Maybe that's yet to come for Jon. But Jon gets killed before leading the men into battle, but not before he's a leader of men. And here's a twist, the meta twist that is the most peculiar kind, the kind of information that you probably won't get elsewhere. In many/most editions, in this chapter only, Daeron is spelled differently. It's spelled E-N instead of O-N. In only this one chapter, in only this one conversation, it's spelled that way twice. Then it's the normal way the rest of the way out. Every other chapter, every other book. If you do Search of Ice and Fire right now, that's what you'll find. So I almost missed this. I knew this and had forgotten because I almost missed the first mention because it's spelled wrong. And then I was like, wait. There is that mention early on. I went back and found it. And then I went and checked my old copy from the 90s. It's spelled wrong there. And then we have a new, like, fancy gold foil limited edition copy we got as part of a gift package. And it's spelled correctly. So they did fix it at some point, but I have no idea when. There's so many editions of A Game of Thrones. It's not the most important thing to track down. But there you go.
I also didn't come across this quote. I was like, I thought for sure. Yeah.
That's why you didn't. If you had searched for the young dragon, you would have found it. That's where it comes back up. Because I was like, why didn't I find that quote? And then I was like, oh, yeah, it's spelled wrong. So, yeah. Perhaps the most unusual feature of this young warrior king was that he wrote a book. Like, you don't think about kings writing books at all, let alone teenage kings. But it wasn't probably, there's a lot of reasons to think that it wasn't because he was, an academic or just a guy who liked books. It was probably propaganda. It was probably meant to justify the conquest, to help maintain the conquest, and a lot of other things. Still, it's very interesting that a king wrote a book about his conquest. And again, the conquest wasn't provoked. So he would maybe need to justify it or to distract from that or just, who knows, lots of different things.
I'm super curious about that. I wonder if it's meant to show like what a prodigy he was, if that's maybe at least part of why Martin set this up. Or I wonder, do we even have enough detail? Is it possible he didn't really write it? Someone wrote it in his name, or he instructed someone to write it and put his name on it. Even that would show a level of wisdom, you know. But I also wonder if maybe it was written 10 years after he died and someone...
It's pretty clear that he wrote it.
For the sake of propaganda.
It is pretty clear that he wrote it, but he may have dictated it. That may be true. But there's lots to talk about his particular style, like his particular way of writing his information, which is important because it parallels... This is an important parallel because it's very much a reference to Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, which we're going to talk about in a minute, which is also written very simply, in part because the simple style allowed it to spread. More people read it, more people picked it up because it was so easy to read. And if you're writing a propaganda piece, you want it to disseminate as much as possible, right? So that's a pretty clever angle to this. Like, yeah, write it. It's like a simple pamphlet that everyone can read and maybe wants to read.
It'll also disguise the propaganda-ish nature of it by being more straightforward.
Yes,
you know,
exactly. How could this simple, direct telling of events be propaganda? Well, there you go. You're right. It makes it more insidious. The fact that it's so simple and to the point conceals the fact that some of those points aren't accurate.
Yeah.
And this is it's also surprising that it also just pushes back on the idea that he's a warmonger. Like, oh, he's a scholarly writer king. Like, how could he be a warmonger? He's a writer. He's bookish. So yeah, it really just it also changes the view of him. And Nina really hones in on that with this comment and how we don't even think of him as a warmonger now. Like we do now. We're thinking of that like as we discuss it. But in history, he's celebrated. There's statues of him. He's this hero who died too young. They, like Benjamin says, people just forget about all the people that died and how it all failed and like it didn't work. Like, why is this guy a hero exactly? And Benjamin's kind of like, I don't really get it, man. Like, you shouldn't want to be like him, But he's kind of being more diplomatic than that. But that's definitely what he's saying. Like, for reading between the lines, he's like, don't idolize that guy, man. Like, don't do that. So we really want to know. That would be why we want to get closer to this kid's personality. Like, was he glory hungry and just really capable at covering his tracks, or did he really think it was justified? Like what's his personality? Like there's a lot of room here. Or supernatural. Did he think he had to? Dreams and all that stuff. Some sort of combination of the two or the three or the five.
I wonder if he might have been almost sociopathic. If he just went through this logical process of analyzing the state of affairs in the kingdom or whatever. And he just realized they wouldn't be expecting it. We have appropriate forces at this moment. We would gain this from it. It would help my legacy. I need to assert myself. I can imagine him looking at all these logical reasons why it would be a good move and not being emotional over the people that are going to die because of it.
Yeah, that kind of removal from guilt and the deaths of commoners that's the standard parlance of powerful kings, I would suppose. They've been raised that way from the get-go. Like, you have to break a few eggs or break a few Aegons to to have a kingdom. So yeah, like I said before, the dragons hadn't technically fully died out during Daeron's youth. By the time he took the throne, I'm just gonna keep saying took the throne, whatever. The dragons had died. But recall that Dunk says his master, Sir Arlen, saw the last dragon before it died. And that would have been early in Daeron's life, in the late 140s, early 150s, something like that. So Prince Daeron actually saw the last dragon die under his father, who acquired the name Aegon the Dragonbane. So as King Daeron, he would rule a fully dragonless Westeros. This might be some of the motivation. Not only do we have his sort of low-energy father, who wasn't a weakling. This isn't Tytos, like being a pushover. But he wasn't overly strong either. He wasn't, shall we say, he wasn't motivated. He wasn't, wouldn't take the initiative necessarily. So maybe Daeron wanted to show that House Targaryen was still a force to be reckoned with, even without dragons. He didn't want anyone getting any ideas about, now they don't have dragons. Maybe they're weak. In the time of Jaehaerys I, he changed policy from Aegon. Aegon the Conqueror would go from castle to castle with his huge retinue, having parties and just showing everybody he was in charge. Jaehaerys went very much the opposite. He went with a tiny retinue, usually arriving ahead of them on his dragon and just letting that do all the talking. He's like, hey, I'm your friendly king, while his huge menacing dragon sits there eating an entire aurochs for breakfast, and he's like, I'm your friend. I'm a good king. So the message is clear. It's like, it's Plato o Plomo all over again, the old mafia conundrum, the silver or the lead, or in this case, the gold or the dragon fire.
The dread.
The gold or the dread. Yeah, that's great, John. The blood or the dread. So, behave and play nice and you'll never have to face this thing. And that was enough. They got the message. It was a subtle yet very not subtle message. And they're like, yeah, he's all by himself. Kill him. No. There's more where he came from, and there's more of those dragons too. Bigger than that one, and that one's huge. So you got to be pretty stupid not to see that message. And Jaehaerys relied on that. He's like, they're not stupid. They'll get it. But by Daeron's
it's
time...
also...
yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say it's also a little bit more... I can't quite think of how I want to describe it, but I want to say like arrogant or personal. He's like, I can mess y'all up all by myself. Don't make me mad. Like the other way, when you show up with a large group and stay to have a party, it's kind of like... we're all part of the same kingdom, like, look, we can work together. We can share our values and da-da-da. But this guy's like, don't make me mad.
Yeah.
Even I by myself, never mind my legacy or the kingdom or the armies, whatever else, I can come mess you up anytime I want. So don't even come close to upsetting me,
And he can remind people that, like, hey, I'm not coming here and eating you out of house and home with my huge retinue. He's like, but I could if I wanted to, and that wouldn't be a declaration of war. That would be so. Look, this is... you want me in charge rather than the guy before, because the guy before was Maegor. So like, it's also he's also just, I'm the opposite of him. So there's that too.
Yeah, I guess there are some good positive ways to look at this appearance also.
So it's context is really important. As to Jaehaerys was also sort of the opposite of Maegor, which Daeron is kind of maybe the opposite of his father Aegon III. But they can't do that anymore. They can't just fly a dragon over and be like, hint, hint. So that subtlety is gone. They can't rely on that. So they had to, maybe he was thinking they had to reestablish a little something because they don't have that anymore. Let's talk about the book a little more for a second. This Conquest of Dorne is very obviously a Westerosi riff on Julius Caesar's Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is Nina's writing here. Both are military histories and ethnographies that detail the stories of conquests of new territories by very capable military commanders and political leaders. Both books are noted for their simple, direct style of writing, with Caesar's book being often studied to this day by Latin students because of its strict adherence to Latin grammar rules. It doesn't matter if it's lying, if you're just reading it to learn grammar. So when Caesar aimed for it to spread and be well read, he couldn't have realized how well that succeeded. It's still read to this day, not because of its value as a military textbook, not because it's a super valuable history book, although those things are in there too, but because it's useful to teach people Latin. I don't know that Daeron's book has that quality, but check this out. Caesar's book says the first line is all Gaul. Well, actually, maybe the first line or in the first paragraph, it says all Gaul is divided into three parts. And then he goes and describes those three parts, the Belgae, the Aquitani, and the Celts, or Gauls in his case, he calls them. Different words for different ethnicities back then, right? And he talks about how they have different language, customs, laws, and appearances, right? What does Daeron's book get into? The sandy, stony, and salty Dornishmen divided into three parts: mountains, shores, deserts, right? They look different. They have different cultures. Some of them have more First Men blood. Some of them have more Andal blood, etc. Yeah, so very, very heavy influence there. The Latin, it's called a Commentarii de Bello Gallico, or just Bellicum Gallicum. Unlike Caesar, Daeron's account actually appears to be more truthful but we don't have a lot of detail on what's in it. We just know he talks about winning battles. We don't have the details of like, then the right advanced and did this, and so we can't say whether that's true or not. We're missing the detail to scrutinize. So maybe when we get more detail, we'll be like, never mind, it wasn't that truthful.
Also, who is it that's saying it appears to be more truthful? These biased maesters or the biased Targaryens?
Yeah, well, I'm saying that because I know Caesar's is pretty dishonest, but Daeron's, I don't know. I don't know that I would go that far because Caesar's is very. I mean, at one point Caesar has a battle where he claims there were 400,000 Gauls and he lost 0 men fighting him. Like, I don't think Daeron goes that far, right?
Yeah.
I'm guessing, but I haven't read. I don't know that he doesn't go that far, but I'm guessing he doesn't go that far. So further evidence that George was thinking of Caesar's book comes. It too is used as a textbook. The Conquest of Dorne is also used as a textbook. Here we go. Davos 5, A Storm of Swords. Davos comes in the room to find Edric Storm and Shireen getting a lesson from Maester Pylos on King Daeron's Conquest of Dorne, which they are reading. Quote,
Princess Shireen and the boys said their farewells courteously. When they had taken their leaves, Maester Pylos moved closer to Davos. My lord, perhaps you would like to try a bit of Conquest of Dorne as well? He slid the slender, leather-bound book across the table. King Daeron wrote with an elegant simplicity, and his history is rich with blood, battle, and bravery. Your son is quite engrossed.
Davos' son is quite engrossed. Remember, Davos' son he's like, Daeron the First worshipped false gods, but he was a great king otherwise and very brave in battle. Remember, because at this point, Davon's become very accepting of Relorism. He's a devout Relorist at this point, and of course, Davos is like, oh, I don't like that part, but he's glad that his son is learning and coming along nicely. And Davos is interested. He's like, yeah, I guess I should read stuff like this, but he's more about reading letters. He needs to read letters. He thinks that's more important. He thinks what's happening now is more important than what happened in the past, which is interesting, but also true, but also not true. Because with the Conquest of Dorne is an example of history repeating itself, and it will repeat itself again. Maybe not literally conquering Dorne, although maybe, I don't know. There are lessons in history that Davos could learn that would be useful for what he's doing now. Same with a lot of the other characters, Stannis, Jon, Dany, everyone, right? And that's what we're doing. And we're having fun with it. Speaking of history, one of the reasons Daeron was named Daeron, and I don't mean, is in this next section called An End to False Daerons. And I don't mean the misspelled Daerons. One of the bigger reveals in Jon's A Game of Thrones, meaning Book 1 arc, is Maester Aemon telling Jon what his last name is or was. Here it is. Maester Aemon, quote,
My father was Maekar, the first of his name, and my brother Aegon reigned after him in my stead. My grandfather named me for Prince Aemon the Dragonknight, who was his uncle, or his father, depending on which tale you believe. Aemon, he called me.
Targaryen? Jon says, right, in response. So this is arguably the first mention of Daeron II, a.k.a. Daeron the Good, even though the name Daeron isn't stated, because his grandfather called him. That grandfather is Daeron II. And of course, Daeron II was probably named for Daeron I, our subject today. So early on, both King Daerons come up in A Song of Ice and Fire. Really important. They're both lessons for the future, for the current characters. They are in George's efforts to make history repeat itself, to make history lessons for the future. This is one of the characters that is at the center of that concept. King Daeron I comes up as much or more than any other king, but in ways that other ones don't. His book, for example, his youthfulness, things like that. We also wonder if any of the other Daerons were named that way, or whether he was named for his mother. Remember, often you're named after your father, especially when you're a boy. You usually don't see boys named after their mother, but his mother was Daenerys. So it's kind of like,
if anyone's seen Ted Lasso, that was a little bit in Ted Lasso's.
Yeah. So it's not the same in Daenerys, Daeron. It's not the same, but it's similar. It's in that same conception, same construction. But there was also there were more Daerons around, so let's talk about that. The second mention of Daeron in the World of Ice and Fire helps explain what this problem was. Quote,
One such incident was the troublesome appearance of several pretenders claiming to be Prince Daeron the Daring, the youngest brother of Aegon II, who was killed at Second Tumbleton, but whose body was never identified, leaving the door open for unscrupulous men to make their false claims.
so it wasn't in honor of Daeron the Daring, rider of the Blue Queen Tessarion, but perhaps a pushback against people pretending to be him, or maybe a little of both. Now, it's confusing because the term pretender to the throne doesn't actually mean pretending to be someone else, but it sometimes does. It doesn't always mean that. In this case, it's literally someone pretending to be Daeron. So when this Daeron was born in 143, Daeron the Daring would have been 27 years already by that time, had he lived, which he didn't. So this may have been to put to rest all these, just kind of settle that issue. Be like, okay, this is a real Daeron Targaryen. He's going to be king, etc. Enough of this nonsense of false Daerons. Of course, his father was Aegon III. Daenerys Velaryon was his mom. And Daenerys was the daughter of Daeron Velaryon. So that's another influence there, another Daeron. And Daeron Velaryon was in turn the son of the notable Sir Vaemond, who we will see on House of the Dragon. Last week I made a small mistake saying the Braavosi ship sunk was the True Heart, but it was the Grand Defiance I meant. It was the True Heart that was also sunk in that battle, so the mistake isn't relevant. Both those ships were sank. It doesn't change the point I made at the time. The True Heart was an allied ship instead of an enemy. And Daeron Velaryon was the captain of that ship, and he died with it. So that was one of Oakenfist's sub-commanders. Although, technically, he wasn't Oakenfist until after that battle. That's where he got the nickname. So that was him who sank the Grand Defiance, the Alan Valerian Oakenfist, and he would become the most important of King Daeron I's young commanders during the conquest of Dorne. Oakenfist would. Along with the Dragon Knight, who was his cousin, and surely some veterans of the Dance of the Dragons. Maybe not a whole lot of veterans from the dance, because by the time the Conquest of Dorne started, it was 157, and the dance ended in 131. So 26 years, even if you were only 20 during the dance and you survived, you're 46 when the Conquest of Dorne breaks out, which means you could still be in the military at that point. But you may not be, probably not a frontline soldier anymore. You might be more of a commander type by then. There's still some knights would be riding to war at that age, but that's
you could be quite fit and capable at 46.
Absolutely, you can. Yes, that's right. Sean and I are both 46. So it was convenient for Aegon III, Nina writes, that his wife's father was both named Daeron and was a dead war hero associated with Admiral Oakenfist. So no outside observer would think it was strange to name an eldest child after a grandparent, and Daeron Velaryon's part was he died a hero, so it makes sense. You name people after dead heroes who were connected to the family, and it's a real family. Velaryon connection is a very strong family connection there, especially going on the mention of the false Daerons. There's a lot of reasons to name him Daeron, and a lot of reasons why that name stuck after that. Nina mentions there's another similar example from history where Henry VIII was named Duke of York when he was only a boy, which was a little unusual because usually that's not given to a child, but it was, there were pretender Richards who were the last Duke of York before him. There were fake Richards, false Richards, kind of like false Daerons, who were trying to claim the Duchy of York. And so to cut that off, Henry VII just gave it to his firstborn when he was only like 3. So that it's like, well, no one can claim it now. It belongs to the son of the king. So put a kibosh on that. Maybe a similar sort of inspiration here. And Nina writes too. We have no idea of his upbringing, really. How close he was to his father. Did he have a dragon egg put in his cradle? Did that practice continue at that point? Because Aegon III did not like dragon eggs. Remember what happened. There was one of the last dragons to hatch was this mutated, horrible white thing that bit Alan and Baela's child when it was born in the crib, And then Aegon was like, no more dragon eggs at court. He made Viserys send his dragon egg back to Dragonstone. So I suspect Daeron did not have a dragon egg put in his crib because his dad was like, I don't like those. I don't want that hatching and eating my child's arm or all of him. So I'm going to guess no, which is a change of tradition. They may have gone back to that tradition later. In fact, I think they did. But definitely would guess that it was discontinued temporarily in there. And we have no idea how he got along with his siblings. His younger brother was the future Baelor the Blessed. Talk about yet another just opposite personality. The most pacifist king of all time by a mile. Follows in the footsteps of perhaps one of the most warmongerish kings of all time. I mean, had Daeron lived longer, maybe he would have calmed down. Maybe he would have started up another conquest or kept trying to conquer Dorne since it didn't take. But yeah, he was probably a talented since he was a talented military commander, you got to figure he paid attention in class and learned about his military history, took to those lessons at least, but maybe he was just talented all around. That part remains a mystery for now.
Even if you're talented all around, it's hard to gain wisdom. It's no matter how much intelligence or knowledge you have in your brain, it's hard to be wise without a certain number of years under your belt.
That's a good point.
And he might not have had the wisdom to understand that even if you can succeed in his military strategy, there's going to be the follow-up of winning the hearts of the people, of maintaining the peace and establishing trade. All these things are sort of interconnected that, and much more difficult to learn. They're much more intricate and dependent upon people's personalities and evolve over time, where, you move this army here, attack this unit, defeat this fleet is a little bit more finite and learnable, if you will.
Great point. And that is very much Daeron in a nutshell, because when it comes to the battles, he was elite, like Robb apparently was, where he had maybe almost a military prodigy's vision of how tactics and strategy could work, and he could see things that traditional strategists would overlook or would not do because it wasn't done. But from his fresh perspective, he could say, well, why don't we do these things? And maybe they should work. And they tended to work. But where you're very, very right is after, in terms of ruling afterwards, of course, of administrating the victory, of when there's a winning the battle, but then there's turning that into a true victory, which he was not capable of doing. And he made very big mistakes as to who he put in charge afterwards, as to what, and those are lessons of history that he didn't take.
It's interesting to think too that if things had gone differently with Robb, he might have had more wisdom. He would have had an advantage on wisdom with Catelyn as an advisor.
Yes.
Right? She would have had this wisdom he doesn't have. And she would have reminded him of the people that died in the battles. That would have been, I think, part of his leadership going forward, was he would have accounted for that.
Yeah, maybe. If he had time to learn from his mistakes. Right, if you survive,
or his mother there advising him,
yes,
right,
too,
instead of some other general and some other captain and some other warmonger,
Very true, very true. So here's the quote that comes when he becomes king. Since we don't know very much about the time before he was king, we'll fast forward to the year 157.
When Aegon III died in the 26th year of his reign, 157 years after the Conqueror was crowned, he left behind 2 sons and 3 daughters. The eldest of his sons, Daeron, was a mere boy of 14 when he assumed the throne. Perhaps because Daeron's charm and genius, or perhaps because of his memory of what transpired during the regency of Daeron's father, Prince Viserys chose not to insist on a regency while the young king was in his minority. Instead, Viserys continued to serve as hand of the king, while Daeron ruled ably and capably.
Okay, so remember, this Viserys is the Viserys who married Lara Rogari. Now, by this time, Lara has left, but Viserys has his own children, Aegon, the future Aegon the Unworthy, Aemon the Dragonknight, and, of course, Princess Nerys. So it is both unusual yet completely fitting that they didn't have a regency. For one, this kid immediately went off to war, which kind of argues that maybe he wasn't ready to be king. On the other hand, he convinced everyone of his plans, and they were like, wow, this is a good plan. On the other hand, he's not going to do much else very well. Oh, maybe that's just because he didn't get a chance to. His book, he wrote that while he maybe should have been administering his conquest of Dorne instead of writing about it, right? But Well, so it's on the other hand as well, though, the regency for Aegon III was a total disaster. It was a bunch of people trying to grab power, especially Unwin Peake, a real piece of work who combines the best virtues. Yes, sarcasm is being laid here, of Tywin and Littlefinger combined into one person. And no one wanted that to happen again. We're like, yeah, maybe the risk of a 14-year-old king is lesser than the risk of another regency council. So this was more of a damned if you do, damned if you don't maybe situation, rather than let's just let the 14-year-old take over. It's not quite that simple. But so it probably would have gone badly either way, but maybe it would have gone less bad had they actually gone with the regency. So...
And you go back and forth with all those on the other hand.
There really are counterbalancing factors.
I think of the Princess Bride, like, clearly can I drink from the glass in front of you?
I would guess that Baelor, the future Baelor the Blessed, was one of his siblings that was very much against this conquest of Dorne, but I doubt he had much say. Meanwhile, his sister Dana, the future Dana the Defiant, who very much looked up to him and probably expected to marry him eventually, because that's what happens, right? The Targaryens marry each other. So she was all for it. But we also don't know a whole lot about her either. She's kind of a missing figure in this time that we would really like to know more about, which Fire and Blood will do for us eventually. She was, quote, a fearsome archer with the Dornish bow her brother Daeron had brought back from his conquest. So he gave her a cool Dornish bow after the First War, and she really liked it. And maybe this is one of the smaller signs that she looked up to him. It seems he was thinking about this conquest before he took the throne, because he did it right away. I mean, the same year he took the throne, this conquest began. That's fast, because you got to get the troops together. You got to have the planning, the logistics. That's real fast. So he was just ready to go. Not that I'm suggesting his father was murdered. There's no evidence of that. And I don't think he's that type of person. Maybe other people would have been. But there's no conspiracy theory here, at least not at this point. But Nina agrees. They were definitely checking for him. He had tuberculosis, to be clear. I should have, that's an important factor. So very strong reason to believe he wasn't poisoned. I don't think tuberculosis it's hard to fake tuberculosis. So he died of that. Of course, they call it a consumption, which, same thing. So maybe that was like, okay, my dad's going to die soon. He's probably not going to make it. Let's start planning to conquer Dorne. Kind of, a little, not the best thing to be doing maybe. But it seems like Alan Valerian Oakenfist was in on it right away. They were planning this. They presented this plan to the council almost immediately, and the council was impressed. They didn't just draw these plans up overnight. It seems like they've been working on it for a while, talking it through, figuring it out. Playing war games, I don't know, like the kind of stuff that like RPG people would be doing, having a good time planning battles or models or whatever, but they're doing it in earnest. They're actually planning a real war.
You know, a couple points on this.
Yeah.
One, I hadn't considered the idea that I had thought about the idea that knowing his father was going to die, maybe he was planning to step into those footsteps with some momentum.
Yeah.
But it didn't occur to me that maybe other leaders in a realm were also considering the implications of the king dying. Maybe they were mobilizing an army and getting logistical stuff ready for a rebellion. If
they
the
were
king
worried
dies,
about
yeah. And since
because
that was already set,
oh yeah, that's part of it.
Yeah. But since that was already set, since troops were ready and forces were mobilized, logistics were on hand, they're like, hey, this is the moment to strike. Let's there's not a rebellion. This might even keep there from being a rebellion, right? If we get all the troops that might have rebelled in an army that goes to Dorne with a common foe, like I could see a lot of other angles that might have come into play here. Also worth noting, thank you. Real war militaries have all sorts of contingency plans for different battles that might go down.
Yeah.
They're constantly ready and training for and playing out different scenarios. What happens if this spot gets invaded, or if this leader gets overthrown, et cetera, et cetera. There's at least modern, sophisticated armies like America or China or whatever else.
Real weakness of the feudal system was that was not the case. Not only the feudal system, but when you rely on levies, only the knights, the household guard, those kind of people, only they are ready. And Westeros didn't usually have standing armies in any era. So yeah, that's they're expensive.
Yeah.
They're very expensive, especially in the era of dragons. They really didn't need them in the era of dragons, where you could just be like, hey, yeah, we can get an army together, but this is sufficient to keep the peace for now.
That was something that I guess Alfred the Great realized, and there would be different scenarios and different spots and moments in history, but he realized the cost of maintaining a standing army was not as great as the loss of Viking invasions.
Yes.
So,
very true.
Okay, I guess we need a standing army. That was a key moment in history.
Yeah, and portrayed on the show The Last Kingdom, as well as very well the books. Which we have a link. You can get them on our website. I'm a big fan.
Did
Books
they
and
portray
show.
Alfred wanting a standing army in the show?
I think he. I don't
he
think
was
it was
in it, but I didn't think like that was a plot line.
I'm not sure they emphasized that, but I think they sorted it because I think Uhtred was part of like that force that was supposed to be ready. Definitely, there was the Huskarls, what they were called, the like badass like ultra ready at all times warrior class that he had. I don't think they were. Yeah, they weren't. It wasn't super emphasized on the show. I think.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know if it was a plot line, but I do seem to remember it was like a decision he made at some point, some sort of council meeting. It might have been just like one line of dialogue in one scene, but historically it was
a huge deal,
a big plot.
Yeah,
line,
and he fortified. He had like, and he also like militarized the borders too, and had forts like defense this fort system, which like this is the kind of thing maybe Daeron would have done had he had time to administer his conquest, but he again was more concerned with writing about it at first. So. Speaking of Oakenfist, getting back to him and the idea that Oakenfist was helping Daeron plan for this, if not encouraging it. Maybe Oakenfist gave him the idea. Who knows? I mean, the idea came from somewhere. It may have been Daeron's own, but the seed may have germinated with someone else. Nina suggests the possibility, and I really like this idea, that Daeron may have really looked up to Oakenfist. Oakenfist was battle-tested, technically a family member. He was a cousin, and had lived in that era that maybe a lot of the young warrior types of Daeron's era would have maybe looked on as glory days, like the day missed out on the Dance of the Dragons, that epic civil war. Of course, people who lived through were like, no, it was awful. But the youth glorifying the wars they missed out on is nothing new. It's a curse of the youth. They're like, yeah, we wanted to be a part of that. No, you didn't. No, you did not. So they're like, let's make our own wars. No, you. See, that's exactly what. This is probably the biggest piece of wisdom that when Sean was referring to, it's hard to learn wisdom in schools. This is probably the most important piece of wisdom that could have been imparted to a person like this, but was not. In fact, the opposite was likely imparted to him, that it was a good thing, that he was probably encouraged by many, if not most, to think and act like this. Not to think of the horrors of that war, but to think of the glories and all that other stuff. And Alan may have been like a living relic of that age. He was the brother of a super loyal young dragon rider, Adam. He tried to tame a dragon of his own and got burned for it, survived it. So he still has burn scars that he could show, and like this evidence of his participation in that. Like evidence of dragons that isn't around anymore. Like, yeah, this guy is a real living legend. I mean, he was super successful. Did so many things. He was a rock star with his "Don't forget the elephant" line. You know, I mean, this guy was really, really famous. I mean, yeah. What are you supposed to do? Nina writes a really good line here. When you're a talented military genius, or used to think you are. What are you supposed to do when you're really good at war when there's no war, but you're the king? Well, you start one. You know, if you're not the king, you have limited options, but if you are...
That might be what you end up doing, but it's not what you're supposed to do.
Yes, you're not. And the rest of the administration was going pretty well, because Prince Viserys, future King Viserys, Uncle Prince Viserys, was highly competent. He was a lot like Tywin without the ruthlessness and ambition. He just had that sort of competence for administration. George may also be well thinking about one of some other real-world parallels here. Charles the 12th of Sweden was king when he was 14, avoided a regency somehow despite being so young, and then insisted on being crowned by the church, and then rode out to battle and died in battle. Maybe was murdered in battle to make it look like a battle injury, but that's a story for another time. And it's possible, like we said, it's possible some of even the people who were wary of him starting a war preferred that to someone like another Unwin Peak coming along to rule from behind the throne. It was definitely like you said, Sean, for the cost of Viking raids. The standing army was cheaper than it's suffering Viking raids. A similar thing here. It's like, yep, the cost of raising armies and starting a war is cheaper than another Unwin Peak in charge. Rock in a hard place.
Especially if you totally discount the Dornish casualties.
Yeah, absolutely, which of course they would, those jerks.
Yeah.
We wonder quite a bit what the realm felt about House Targaryen at this time, too. Like, we wonder what Targaryens thought of themselves now that they didn't have dragons, now that they had endured this civil war. What did the realm think of them after all this? Did they think, with the loss of dragons, did they think now the Targaryens are weak now, or was it just, well, they're weaker but they're still on top? What was the view of them? We don't really know, but it may enter into Daeron's thinking, maybe why he wanted to show strength. Did it put pressure on him to marry, which he never did? Of course, he was only 14, and like we said, there was lots of other Targaryens, so there wasn't a lot of pressure for him to marry from a child perspective, having children. But politically speaking, that's the rub, right? Without dragons, remember the primary reason for incest marriages ostensibly was dragon riding. Did that thinking change? When there was no dragon riding to do, did they care? Arguably, marrying into great houses became more important because they had no dragons and needed to back up the throne with another ally that could provide wealth and swords. But Nina points out, yeah, that's true. But at the same time, they might want to just really emphasize that they're the Targaryens. Like, yes, we're still different. We're still exceptional. Our look helps distinguish us, helps tie us to the old blood. Stability is important. People care about kings maintaining. Lannisters have held power for a long time. The Dornish, the Martells have had power for hundreds of years. Westeros likes stability. Were they trying to just keep that going? Or did they need to kick things up to show that they still had it? Tightrope walk, because you can really see both of these things. You can really see why both of those things would matter. But which mattered more? That's the kind of detail we don't have. And whether they were reading the situation correctly is another matter. Maybe they correctly assessed the dangers of their current scenario and acted in a way that made it worse. We don't know. One thing they did still have, very important to note, in line with Alan Oakenfist, they had House Velaryon, which was weaker than it had been during the dance, but still very powerful. They no longer had dragons, but they still had a huge fleet. Their wealth had diminished, but it was still a very rich and powerful house. So, talk about displaying power, you'd want to have him around. All right, our next section is called Dreams of Conquest. Let's have a nice, lengthy, awesome quote. This is how he presented himself.
Few foresaw that Daeron, the first of his name, would cover himself in glory, as did his ancestor Aegon the Conqueror, whose crown he wore. His father had preferred a simple circlet. Yet that glory turned to ashes almost as swiftly. A youth of rare brilliance and forcefulness, Daeron at first met resistance from his uncle, his counselors, and many great lords when he first proposed to, quote, complete the conquest by bringing Dorne into the realm at last. His lords reminded him that, unlike the Conqueror and his sisters, he had no more dragons fit for war. To this, Daeron famously responded, "You have a dragon. He stands before you."
Ooh.
In the end, the king could not be gainsaid, and when he revealed his plans formulated, it is said, with the help and advice of Alan Velaryon, the Oakenfist, some began to think it could indeed be done, for the proposed campaign improved upon that of Aegon's own.
So intellectually, the way it was presented, they were impressed. They were like, wow, because first they seemed like, nah, Dorne is so hard to attack. Look at all the previous attempts. It all failed. What makes you think you could do it any better? And then he showed them and they were like, oh, okay, well, actually, maybe you can. And this is another reason why maybe he was called the young dragon in his day, because he called himself a dragon. He's like, you have a dragon. He stands before you. He's like, I'm the dragon. So that's kind of why I lean towards yes. They called him that during his time.
Yeah, I assume from that they probably called him the Dragon.
Yeah,
I was just unsure about the young part.
Okay.
It makes sense. He was young. I can
Yeah,
easily see
14.
it, but I was just curious.
It's not an insult. He is young.
Right,
In some way,
yeah.
it makes him more impressive. They're more impressed by him by referring to his youth. So yeah. And he also
Maybe it was a slight though. Like, yeah, he's a dragon, but he's inexperienced. He's not wise. He screwed it up. He conquered well, but he was too young to manage well.
After the fact, it does seem less like a compliment. Yeah, because this youthfulness, his youthful inexperience, definitely cost him. And he took the crown of Aegon. He took the conqueror's crown and wore that, which most of the kings after Aegon did not wear it. Aenys had this big, gaudy, golden crown made. Maegor didn't have Aegon's crown because it was taken, if I remember correctly. And Aemon wore Aegon's crown for a little while, not because not to be king, just to mark himself as I'm cool. So it wasn't worn often, but it definitely suggested a lot. You generally put it on if you're like a warlike Targaryen, if we're looking at the patterns. So Maegor did wear it for sometimes, but I think he had it stolen from him. So, but he was definitely warlike. So anyway, so they were sold on the idea, and should they have been? Well, given the end result, no, they shouldn't have. I think it pretty clearly the answer is no. They were sold a bill of goods that they should not have purchased. But that tells you something about how convincing and energetic and just, it says rare forcefulness. So he may have probably didn't threaten his counselors, but maybe just, you don't want to get on my bad side, that kind of thing. Like, this is happening, do you want to be against me or with me? That kind, I don't know, just some sort of negotiating from strength. Like, don't forget who's the king, that kind of thing.
You can also imagine there might have been characters behind him, like Littlefinger or Varys or whatever, that might have manipulated things to go like it would. And those characters wouldn't have made it into the history books necessarily either.
Yeah, and Oakenfist might be that type of character. I mean, I'm not saying he's super cunning, sneaky guy, but he was smart. And if he wanted to go for Dorne, if he had his reasons, which we'll get to what those might have been, then, especially if Daeron idolized him, then he would really listen to him.
And even if he was maybe more honorable, on some level, Ned and Littlefinger were working together at first, at least. You know?
And Oakenfist wasn't trying to screw Daeron over. That's for sure. Like, unlike Littlefinger, who was definitely trying to screw Ned over.
Yeah.
And Oakenfist was somewhat right, because the naval aspect to this campaign was crucial and decisive. And presumably that was Oakenfist's call, or his realization how decisive it would be. And it was something that Aegon did not do. And that was part of the improving on his plan aspect. So that's really important. But Oakenfist apparently also had no great ideas about what to do after the battles were won. He was also not some skilled administrator, apparently, or couldn't be bothered to. We're not sure, really. But
it's interesting to think that maybe it wasn't incorrect for them to accept this battle plan in this war, but that they should have required an amendment for how to manage it after the fact.
Yeah. So we wonder, again, returning to the issue of what justified this attack when they had promised not to. I mean, sure, they could just ignore their promise. It wasn't his promise. It was his great, whatever, how many greats, grandfather that made that promise, not him. And Nina says also maybe they could get away with it because the Martells hadn't exactly been the most faithful friends either. I mean, there were Vulture Kings that were probably supported by the Martells indirectly, who invaded the realm. The Martells were like, we didn't have anything to do with that. They probably did have a little something to do with that, if not a lot to do with that. There was also Morian Martell, who, remember, we called him Prince Moron, the one who loudly announced his plans to invade the Stormlands, and then Vermithor just came in and just torched them all. Or was it Vermithor? One of the dragons came in and torched them when they were trying to land in the Stormlands, and that went very poorly. So you could argue that the peace was already broken. Like, well, one of you guys attacked us, so that is invalid. So maybe there were just enough things they could point to say, like, that you guys broke that deal long ago. Like Alejandro Martell as well called herself the new Nymeria. Remember, she's the one who married Drazenko Rogare, as we mentioned last week. And she was like allowing knights and lords to win her favor by daring bold raids into the marches. So that is not upholding the peace. So I think they had a pretty strong argument that the Dorne wasn't holding up its end of this agreement either. So maybe this isn't as egregious as when we first introduced it. Maybe it's not so bad. Either way, it's something we're going to want to get more on. Maybe the death of the dragons was tied to this more than we thought. Maybe the Dorne started to get a little more uppity, started to push the borders a bit more because, hey, there's no more dragons. That was the one thing that really was messing us up. We're not worried about them bringing armies into our territory. Maybe they should have been, because Daeron did that. But at the time, leading armies into Dorne had pretty much been a universal failure every time it had been tried, sooner or later. Meanwhile, if we get a little tinfoily, can entertain the idea that Daeron knew, assuming this idea even existed in the first place, that Daeron knew about the idea that the dragons were supposed to save the world, or the House Targaryen was supposed to save the world. Well, they would have been like, well, that was clearly wrong. There's no dragons. So they may have been like, well, that prophecy was wrong. Or they may have been like, well, to truly fulfill the prophecy, we really have to have the whole continent conquered. Either of those are possible.
I have a feeling, I feel like he didn't know and that it was lost at that point.
Yeah.
Just saying, like, I think after it seems that we're going to see it get lost in the Dance of the Dragons during House of the Dragon, that knowledge.
I would guess you're probably right about that. Like, again, the book Signs and Portents is maybe one of our best clues, or what we should be honing in on. And that book would probably contain all this information, and that book was lost at some point. Maybe a lot happened at Dragonstone, infighting.
Yeah.
And stuff getting stolen. That's the type of time when relics and valuable stuff disappears, and the chaos and tumult of two sides fighting it out in the halls and changing over who's in charge and all that. Yep, things do get stolen when leaders switch out, don't they? Real world parallels, don't we have? Yes, interesting. Yes, what could I be talking about? So again, I'm curious. Was the plan of attack so good that Daeron was like, we got to do this? Or was he just so confident going in, any plan, he was going to be like, yes, this is going to work, because he was just so eager and ready? Maybe a little both. Like, the plan did work. As bad as the aftermath was handled, the conquest itself doesn't seem to be an I mean, they did it. They conquered. Like, that's not an exaggeration. It worked. He may have undersold how many men he lost. He may have exaggerated how many men they defeated. But he still did something that no one else had done before. So it is impressive. That's not exaggerated, that they definitely conquered Dorne. Even though it didn't hold, no one had even done that much before.
Just a quick thought. It occurs to me, even if Aegon or whoever in the past had conquered Dorne, they might have lost it too.
Yeah.
Who's to say they would have been able to hold on?
You're right. I mean, the Dornish do not like being ruled from the outside until they were brought in from marriage, until it was like, hey, we're friends, until it was like more of a alliance of equals. That worked. It was also, given all this, it was another lesson is maybe we should be one realm. If another Daeron's going to come by eventually, then maybe we should just marry y'all and prevent this from happening, especially since it's a way to vault right to the top. We're marrying the kings and queens, so, that should give them good footing to have some stability and power and not get screwed out of the arrangement. So in a span of a year, he had gotten all the armies together and started the conquest. Within another year, it was done. Only 1 year. That's really fast. That's really impressive. And this is important to emphasize, because this is why people remember him so greatly. He constantly impressed them with things that hadn't been done before. Even though, there are things that shouldn't have been done, they're impressive. Like, I look at someone who walks a tightrope over the Grand Canyon. Should you have done that? I don't know. Was that really necessary? But whether you should have or not, it was damn impressive. It's like, it's like, should you have? But it's also, wow. The ability, the courage, the actually doing it, like in the moment. There's one thing practicing for it when you have like the nets and all that, and you actually do it, like, wow. So I don't know why that, of all things, was the example I chose to use, but it argues that his impressive character is part of what got him such buy-in from the other great lords. and Oakenfist on the personal level. This is really important. There's a lot of room for drama, for conspiracy, for personal relationships having a big time effect on global politics. Oakenfist, let's remember, not long after the Dance of the Dragons, he was sent by Unwin Peak to deal with the Red Kraken. He had to sail his fleet all the way around the steps, all the way through the Stepstones, around Dorne, which is really dangerous, and then up to fight an Ironborn ruler in his home turf at sea. Yeah, that sounds like an easy job, doesn't it? We talked about that in our Stepstones episode, how he had to get through the Stepstones and talk to talk to Ricalio Rendoon and do all this weird stuff there. Then he goes to Dorne and hooks up with Alliandra Martell. Literally hooks up with her. There's rumors they had a child. Probably didn't happen, but maybe. And she, again, was a warlike, ambitious princess who called herself the New Nymeria and then later married Drazenko Rhaegar, who, again, came up last week in the Lysene episode. It was Drazenko who approached Alan in the first place to inform him, hey, yo, we've got Prince Viserys. We'll ransom him back to you. And so Alliandra may have had children with Drazenko before he was murdered. We're not sure if they had kids or not. So either she or one of those children, her descendants with Drazenko, would have been in charge of Dorne when this conquest of Dorne started. So he put that all together. Oakenfist helps Daeron plan this invasion of Dorne. He has personal connection to the ruler or her children, if it's not her that's still in charge. That's super interesting. So their personal relationship may absolutely play a role here. It may play a big role. He may have been mad at her. He may have felt jilted. I'm not saying that's definitely the case. He may not have cared at all. They may have just had a little fling and that'd be the end of it and no hard feelings. But if he did have hard feelings, this could be like, this is how we get those Dornish back or something like that. So strong possibility of personal connections here. But also,
if he had
go ahead,
made some promise, I'll be back, or I'll prove myself, or I'll show you some kind of thing like that, or
chip
if she
on his
chose
shoulder.
some other guy over him, he wanted to beat that guy. Also sailing around Dorne might have given him the insight of I could take that harbor or whatever.
Yeah, he's got to see it up first. Yeah. Good point. He saw it.
Might have got insights into the state of their navy or their defenses or whatever from just conversations with her or other people around her.
Yeah. The political and global considerations are pretty huge too, though. As much as the personal connections might matter, during the era of the Rogares, remember Dorne claimed the Stepstones for a while, which put them in a great position of power that the Iron Throne would not have been pleased with. So they might have been, we can't have that happen again. We need to just take Dorne, and then they won't cut it. There won't be 6 different powers in the world that can cut us off from the Stepstones. Dorne, Tyrosh, Lys, random pirates here and there, Bravos. Now take one of those big players off the board and make them an ally instead. It gives them a lot more control over what's going on in the Stepstones. Indeed. All right. Here's our sort of halfway point. Let's take a few questions and a few other things, and then we'll get back to it. Do we know the name of the Dornish prince who submitted to Daeron I? Question from Sean Pink. Who is that?
That's a really good question.
We actually don't, but he was the father of Meryn Martell, the Meryn who married Daenerys, the Meryn who built the Water Gardens. So that guy's dad is the one who bent the knee to Daeron. And he also is the same guy that bent the knee peacefully to Daeron II as part of the marriage. So he bent the knee twice to Daerons. He bent the knee to 2 different Daerons, and then bequeathed.
So he's in charge for a long time and part of 2 big moments, and still we don't have a name, huh?
Yeah. Not the only Dornish leader whose name we're lacking.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't get me started on Dornish leaders that we should know. We have a lot of the unnamed Princess of Dorne and the unnamed Prince of Dorne situations.
Yeah, at least it's a dude this time.
Yeah, at least it's a dude. I can say it's just personal to the Dornish, not to women.
Yeah. So, actually, I think I goofed. I think Meryn bent the knee to Daeron II. Yeah, Meryn bent the knee to Daeron II. This guy, unnamed guy, bent the knee to Daeron I. But he also arranged the marriage of his daughter Mariah to Daeron II. So he did do that. So he did do at least 2 major things. And that's Mariah is mother of Baelor Breakspear. So Daeron II and Mariah are mother of Baelor and Maekar and that group. So that's important. And the House of the Dragons mush, which, or not House of the Dragons, but Westeros.org's game, they had a role-playing game going, which takes place in this era. So they had to give this guy a name. They called him Marance just because they needed to give him a name. So that's just, they may, and you know, George might go with that because George occasionally has used their fill-in names in spots like this because they had to give someone a name. There's at least two or three other examples, but there's also examples where he gave a name and they had to retroactively change theirs.
On the subject of you were saying Mariah Martell.
Yeah.
I'm going to posit that I feel that it should be Miriam Martell for two reasons. One, it used to be Mariah, it used to be spelled Maria, and it got changed to Y, and I think that's to make it be more in line with the Nymeria root. Like, I think that, like, just like we have Miriam Martell. Anyways,
Miriam.
I think Miria is meant to be a little bit closer to Nymeria's name than Mariah.
Okay, maybe Myria.
Yeah, Myria. Yeah, I think. Anyways, that just randomly.
Anyway, yeah, you're probably right. Your Nymeria is probably what they're going for.
Yeah, probably going for that, and that's why he changed it from Mariah with the A to the Y to make it a little bit closer because it did change.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. Question from last week that relates to this one. We've already, in fact, touched on this topic briefly. This is from Kat Ovivas. When you're talking about Daenerys the Dreamer and her book, Signs and Portents, it gave her an idea regarding the letter that we referred to, the one that was presented to Aegon the Conqueror by Prince Nymor, the one that made him abandon the conquest of Dorne. He, remember, flew back to Dragonstone for a bit and then came back and said, okay, yes, I accept. We're not going to fight you anymore. Her thought is, now she includes a possible bunch of different theories here, but I just want to narrow it down and or actually broaden it and just say, what if Signs and Portents is what he went and checked? He went and looked at the book to refer to certain things that were said to him, to see if they lined up, to see, okay, maybe we don't need Dorne, maybe we just need, maybe I'm taking this too literally. Who knows? There's a lot of possibilities here. I don't want to zoom in too much on something we have no idea about. But I like the idea that Kat Ovivas has planted here that that's what he was doing. Maybe not even Signs and Portents, but ancient texts, some old book, a glass candle. I don't know. I don't know if they had glass candles there, but it wouldn't be surprising if they did. Something that was on Dragonstone that because it's weird that he would go there. Like, why not just lock himself in his chair? If he just wants some time to think and be alone, he's the king. No one's going to bother him if he says, don't bother me. So it really argues that there's something he wanted to refer to, reference, see, interact with back on Dragonstone, and Signs and Portents is a great guess as a possibility. Kat Ovivas also says, in this case, the fulfillment of the prophecy could be something we are still waiting to see. It may refer to Daenerys and like that. I'm so looking forward to all this. Me too, Kat Ovivas. Me too. Also important to note that Alexander the Great was an inspiration for the young dragon, and George has said that straight out. And so if our main three examples for historical parallels are him, Henry V of England, which we mentioned earlier, and Charles XII of Sweden, who we mentioned earlier. Charles XII was the Swedish young king who died in battle that may have been a murder. Alexander the Great, I'm a huge fan of Alexander the Great. I was like obsessed with him in my 20s, and one day I'll have to do some more work paralleling his influence on characters in Song of Ice and Fire, perhaps. I would have fun with that. And I would hope you would too. Guilty Undertaker says, were there any wars early in Aegon IV's reign? If so, he probably wielded it, meaning Blackfire. When were the Wildfire Dragons? Well, the thing is, Aegon IV just ordered people to do stuff. He didn't really participate himself. Were there wars early in Aegon IV's reign? I don't think so. I can't recall any. There may have been some wars with the outside of Westeros where they were sending navies to fight with some of the free cities, but definitely nothing that Aegon IV would have personally fought in himself. He was already getting overweight, and he just wasn't going to go into battles. So yes, the Wildfire Dragons were later in his reign. They were in the mid 170s, if I recall correctly. Don't quote me on that. It's not super important. It was a big deal when he did it because his son's wife was Dornish, and this is unprovoked attack against Dorne when his daughter-in-law is Dornish, the princess of Dorne, former princess of Dorne, or daughter to the princess of Dorne, or the prince of Dorne. And his wildfire dragons were a huge disaster. But he didn't lead that army either. He just ordered them to go, and it was a huge failure. And then he just tried to pretend it didn't happen, I guess. Guilty Undertaker says, Daeron went off to war while Viserys remained safely in King's Landing. Just saying, good point. Maybe Viserys was happy to have the young king go out on campaign so he could just administer things in peace without this kid around, causing problems.
And I mean, and if he had any sort of ambition, he's like, oh, well, if he dies, it's only good for me.
That's true. Then it would pass to Baelor, which would be weird, but...
It would be closer to him being in this. I mean, I don't know that he was that ambitious.
He would have been next after him, yeah.
But,
it is speculated that Viserys poisoned Baelor, but not right away. Baelor ruled for 10 years. This is like, we got to get rid of this guy. He's a disaster. But that's just very vague speculation. There isn't much to sink your teeth into as far as evidence. It's just the kind of thing he might have done because of the scenario. We're not really sure. And Dornish Dame says, when Daeron became king, he was around the same age Alan Oakenfist was at the start of the dance. Very true. Daeron would have also have presumably grown up hearing of Benjamin Blackwood's exploit in the dance. Also very true. Yeah, there were some very young, capable, not just warriors, but leaders. Benjamin Blackwood became the leader of House Blackwood's forces despite being under 16. And Oakenfist as well was 16-ish, even younger maybe, when the dance broke out. He was trying to fly a dragon, leading ships, fighting battles. Yeah, all these guys. So yeah, Daeron would have looked to characters like that for what he wanted to be like. He wanted to show he was capable as them or more so. All right, back to it. The actual war itself. Like I said, we don't have a lot of details on what happened during the battles. We just have these sort of overviews. But let's work with what we have. Quote.
I mean, there's a whole book about it, but I just haven't read that book yet. All right. Daeron I amply proved his prowess on the field of Dorne, which for hundreds of years had defied the Reach, the Stormlands, and even the dragons of House Targaryen. Daeron divided his host into three forces, one led by Lord Tyrell, who came down the Prince's Pass at the western end of the Red Mountains of Dorne, one led by the king's cousin and master of ships, Alan Valerian, traveling by sea, and one led by the king himself, marching down the treacherous pass called the Bone Way, where he made use of goat tracks that others considered too treacherous to go around the Dornish watchtowers and avoid the same traps that had caught Orys Baratheon. The young king then swept away every force that sought to stop him. The Prince's Pass was won, and most importantly, the royal fleet broke the Planky Town and then was able to drive upriver.
All right, let's pull up the map. If you are watching the video, you can see it on screen. If you're listening on Spotify, flip the video on and you can see it just for a minute, and then you can flip it back to podcast-only mode, or just take a look at the map later at your convenience. So, first of all, what Oakenfist did. The Planky Town is right there at the mouth of the Greenblood, which flows out near Sunspear there. So basically by sailing his fleet upriver there, he split Dorne in half. What would be a method of moving ships and soldiers and supplies and bringing them all together into one army for the Dornish would be their main advantage, then became an advantage for House Targaryen, for the invaders, because this main central waterway in Dorne became conquered. And instead of an advantage for the defenders, it was a huge advantage for the attackers. It was very much a divide and conquer strategy. If you want to look at it which Julius Caesar did, he attacked the different tribes individually, did things to keep them from allying, using politics and intrigue, but also just getting there first, attacking them before they could link up, doing things to delay their linkings so that he could destroy them piecemeal. I came, I saw, I conquered. That was Julius Caesar's famous line. Daeron could have said the same thing, given how quickly he did it. And, well, in Caesar's case, that conquest stuck. Most of it. Not the England part. That's one of the things he maybe kind of glossed over. That's one of his failures. But they kept Gaul, although it took decades longer, actually about 100 years, if I remember correctly, for it to be fully settled and where there were no more rebellions. So, yeah, it's hard to conquer a place, and it was not even in Caesar's lifetime was that fully acclimated. So looking at the map. You got the two main passes. You got the Bone Way and the Prince's Pass. The three ways into Dorne are thus by sea and through those two passes. Armies, it's been said dozens of times that many armies have died in those passes. It's too hot. It's too sandy. It's easy to ambush. They don't know where they're going. You can get led astray by guides. You can get lost even with a guide. It's hell. So
numbers don't matter as much when you're going through a narrow pass either. You could have 500 people, but if only the front 10 can fight, then 30 people might beat you, or have a chance against you at least.
And if you have too many people, it's all the more reason to have supplies too. So you want to have an army that's the right size, not too big, not too small. But what is not too big, not too small? That's the question, isn't it? So Daeron himself led his army through the Bone Way, past some of the most dangerous Dornish houses, ones that's the Oris Baratheon is referred to here. He had his hand chopped off after he was captured by the Will of Will, if you recall. So one of the principes of war is if you can choose the field of battle, you're doing great. Dorne's home field advantage, they're basically always choosing the field of battle because they're used to this desert mountain warfare. Daeron just said, no, we're just going to bypass your best advantage here, sneak around using goat tracks. We're not going to confront you in the spot where you have the most advantage. We're going to get past that and then fight you in the open spaces where your advantage is limited. Fight you in the area where our armies have river support now, where they can be supplied from the water, whereas before, what are we going to do? Keep bringing supplies down through this perilous passes? No, of course not. They would just cut that off. Once you move out of there, try to bring supplies through, they're going to know, and they're going to attack those supply trains. You can't, if it's hard to bring an army through, it's going to be even harder to bring a supply train through it's much more vulnerable. These aren't fighting men or has fewer fighting men. So,
a lower ratio of fighting soldiers,
much more vulnerable,
and et cetera. Yeah.
So rather than face them on what was provably unwinnable ground, they shifted the field of battle to other places. Daeron seemed to be of a mind that the war would be fought on his own terms, even in their lands, even without dragons. And this is interesting because it's almost like not having dragons made them come up with new strategies. They didn't rely on the dragons, and it made them rely more on their ground troops, which, how many times have we said in this, Sean, you can't conquer a place with Air Force only. You have to bring in the ground troops. And they definitely over-relied on the dragons in the original conquest because, well, for one thing, it was too hard to bring troops into Dorne. Daeron found a way to pass that problem. Or maybe Alan Oakenfist did.
I wonder if that's another reason for the invasion at this moment. I mean, of course, Daeron had to have some sort of motivation or have been convinced or be able to convince other people. But it could have been new intelligence that they had about another route, another way to get through.
Yeah.
Someone like, it might be that Targaryen leaders, military councilmen or whatever, have been searching for some alternate way to get through there, and they finally found it. Like, we realized we can go through these goat tracks and get this number of troops, this amount of time. If that coincided with Daeron becoming a new king, or Oakenfist wanted to push for this move, some new piece of intelligence might have put it over the top.
Yeah, right on.
Another thing that some Littlefinger type character might have contributed to, that never would have made history books, or hasn't yet made history books.
Bribe some locals to find these tracks or whatever, but actually make sure they're legit, because that's the thing we've talked about. We've had guides that lead armies to places on purpose to screw them over. You wouldn't just trust any random Dornishman given that history. So yeah, you'd want to do your due diligence on that, but that might indeed be how they found these routes. As for what Daeron looked like, well, he was in battle. He wore elaborate black and gold plate mail, of course covered with dragon insignias, surely. And he fought with Blackfire, so he would have been quite a stirring sight to see, surrounded by his all-white Kingsguard, because he fought from the front. Let's be clear about that. He wasn't a command from the rear type of kid. He was right there in the front. Of course, safer than most front leading commanders, given the Kingsguard around him, and given that one was Aemon the Dragonknight, who was arguably one of the best fighters in Westeros of all time. So this is also important, not just to evade fighting in territory that is severely to the enemy's advantage, it keeps them hidden. Like they're like, well, where did they go? Like we're used to, as the Dornish, when people invade their territory, they used to be able to keep track of them because the other side has no idea where they're going. They know the Dornish know the terrain so well. Like, oh, they're heading this way. That means they're going to go there and then there. And they're like, oh, wait, they didn't go that way. Where are they? So they find themselves in the unusual situation of an invading army they expect to be a little bit lost, actually outmaneuvering them, which is like, whoa, that was a huge surprise. Might have backfooted them a bit and may have scared them a little bit. We're like, well, okay, this is not going how we expected. They may have been cocky, like, those fools are sending armies into, this will be easy. We'll mop these guys up. And the next thing you know, they've gotten around them. They're like behind us now. Like, oh, how did they do that? So at some point they may have started to get truly concerned. Like, this is a well-led army. They probably like, they're cocky, like, some 14-year-olds leading the army. This will be easy. Yeah. At one point they had to wake up and realize they were in real danger.
Yeah, sometimes you just get complacent too. Even when you have all the advantages and you assume you won't be attacked, you're not prepared for an attack. That was part of Joan of Arc's success, right?
Yeah,
she would attack places that were better fortified or manned, but she just had this like destiny of God determination. And so they would show up at a fort with 300 soldiers, and they had 70 soldiers. And she just said, well, let's just attack anyway. And it worked because the 300 soldiers, like, there's no way they're going to attack us. So they weren't prepared for an attack. And they did attack them and won. And it worked several times in a row until, like you said, eventually, like, okay, I guess we need to get ready for Joan of Arc.
Yeah, they kept just underestimating her over and over. Yeah, it was true. That was a recurring feature of that. And the Dornish may not have underestimated Daeron as much as the French and English underestimated Joan of Arc, but there was definitely some underestimating going on here, and at some point they had to wake up and realize they were making mistakes. Now, this was the Bone Way that he snuck them through, the most dangerous of the routes. So he also took on the most dangerous of the three jobs himself. Lord Tyrell came down the Prince's Pass, which is still nasty, but not as nasty. Let's talk about this Lord Tyrell for a second. This Tyrell is in the same class as a Daeron would be, in that he wasn't part of the dance and may have wanted to be. His house sat out the dance. You're going to maybe notice, a lot of y'all know this already, the House Tyrell is pretty absent from the Dance of the Dragons. That's because the Lord of Highgarden was a boy. He was an infant. His mother and their Regency Council were like, yeah, we back the Greens, but then they didn't send any military out. And then when things started to go bad for the Greens, they were like, we're just going to continue to do nothing. Yeah, we'll just stay here. And then, after the war, the Hightowers almost started ticking it up again. And that's when the Tyrells were like, all right, you're our bannermen, Hightowers. Stop it. If you go to war again, we're executing your son. They had a page there. They had one of them was a page to the Lord of Highgarden, so they had him effectively as a hostage. And so that threat worked. So that was like, okay, the dance might have come back up again if not for that. So this is the same infant lord, 26 years later, Lionel Tyrell. So he may have been, and he was also kind of a high energy, aggressive guy, probably got along with Daeron, probably why Daeron appointed him. So to be leader of this army. And a lot of mistakes are going to be made. Not during the war, but after. Lionel Tyrell. You maybe have forgotten who Lionel Tyrell is, but you're going to be reminded in a minute of what happened to this guy.
You know who Lionel Tyrell is on the Dorne map.
Yeah, we know who he is. He's
not visible on the screen right now, but it is Brynden Beefish.
Jeff Hartline is Lionel Tyrell. Does that ring a bell?
There might have been some motivation for the Tyrells to, I don't know, recommit, to prove themselves. Like, no, we're really loyal. We'll head first into this battle.
Good point.
In case it wasn't clear after that whole dance scenario, let us assert ourselves.
Maybe they needed to reassert their power, given how they hadn't done anything. And they had a lot of unspent power, you could argue, too. Like, they were less
that's very true.
Used by the war. Although, I mean, a whole generation had passed, so they presumably would have recovered a lot anyway, even if they had expended a lot. But regardless, they didn't even do that. They didn't even expend during the dance. So, also really important to remember that it was a Tyrell who led the armies into Dorne alongside Aegon the first time around. the one whose army just vanished in the desert after, I think it was a stop off at the Hellholt. It was. So this Tyrell may have been wanting to get a little revenge for that, or make good on that, or do it right this time, or erase that failure, something like that. So again, it's another thing that just mirrors the conquest itself, as you've got Daeron, who's the dragon like Aegon the Dragon. You have a Tyrell as the top commander, of Velaryon as the head of the navy. Very similar circumstances. Now, moving onward. By the way, shout out to our good friend and occasional guest, Jim McGeehan, aka Something Like a Lawyer. His Tumblr is full of notes on this conquest. Him being a very military-minded fellow, you would definitely get something out of checking that out. Nina and myself recommend it. Here's another quote that describes what happened with the taking of the Green Blood and how that played out the rest of the war.
With Dorne effectively divided in half by Lord Elend's control of the Greenblood, the Dornish forces in the east and west could not aid one another directly, and from this stemmed a series of bold battles that would take a volume entire to relate in full. Many accounts of this war can be found, but the best of them is the Conquest of Dorne, King Daeron's own account of his campaign, which is rightly considered a marvel of elegant simplicity in both its prose and its strategies.
Yandel isn't exactly neutral on the Conquest of Dorne. Rightly considered a marvel of elegant simplicity in both its prose and its strategies. So again, the divide and conquer strategy is very clear here. Separate the Dornish, keep them from getting together. The reason why taking the river makes east and west Dorne hard to unite is for their armies to march together, to combine, they have to march along the Greenblood where there'd be supplies and fresh water. Otherwise, they have to head out over open desert. But they can't march alongside the river when the Targaryens control it. So, big problem there. Very well done, gotta say. Again, despite the uncoolness of an unprovoked invasion, they definitely did it right, at least this portion of it. Here is the next quote describing things getting wrapped up fairly quickly.
Within a year, the invaders were at the gates of Sunspear and battling their way through the so-called Shadow City. In 158 AC, the Prince of Dorne and 20 of the most powerful Dornish lords bent their knees to Daeron at the submission of Sunspear. The young dragon had accomplished what Aegon the Conqueror never had. There were rebels still in the deserts and mountains, men swiftly branded as outlaws, but they were fewer in number to begin with.
The ships, control the waterways, nullified another major advantage, and all that stuff. The Dornish could see that they were losing, and they could see that this was a different sort of scenario. However, conspiracies. You got to think. Two important factors here. Just because they bent the knee, are they Balon Greyjoying here? Are they like, well, we're bending the knee so we can stand back up later and with swords in hand? Like there's no shame in bending the knee if you're just trying to bide time to attack again later. And nowhere else in Westeros are the orders of the nobility followed less than in Dorne. If the nobles bend the knee in the north, then the rest of the northerners under that person's charge tend to go along with that decision. Ditto the Reach, ditto the Stormlands over the west. But in Dorne, the commoners were like, I don't care if our lords bent the knee. Why does that mean we have to? So that was a failure of analysis on the king's part and his advisors to not recognize that state of affairs, which had endured for hundreds of years. This wasn't new. They should have known that.
You know, that's a parallel maybe to Caesar's attacking Gaul. That's France, you know.
Yeah.
And writing about it afterwards. Same thing in World War II when the Nazis just rolled in and swept through France pretty quickly, and the president of France, you know, surrendered. But the people of France didn't.
Yeah.
They kept rebelling throughout the war. I mean, that was like a big, I don't know, that's what the movie Casablanca is about. You know?
Yeah. So there's not the leaders surrendering doesn't always mean everyone's going to follow that lead. You know, it depends on how well liked that leader was or how much, you know, authority they truly have. And well, in Dorne, the Martells haven't ruled for eons. They've only ruled for hundreds of years. You know, they respect Nymeria, sure, but there's always been that stubborn independence. Dorne was the last kingdom to ever truly be united within itself, and it maybe arguably never has fully been as united because of the just the nature of the place. It's divided within itself because of the vast deserts between that separate them. They don't have as much back and forth
geographically and culturally. Right.
Yeah.
And maybe even historically, like the border skirmishes, between the people in the mountain passes, they have more, I don't know, like, some Dondarrion kill my uncle or whatever, whereas some nobleman in Sunspear doesn't know or care about that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's a lot like the free folk. They're super diverse within their own realm, and geography explains a lot of that diversity. Like the Valley of the Fens is like very isolated, and thus they have cultural microcosm going on there. There's some similar aspects to Dorne in that sense. Here's where we see the comparison to Henry V. We mentioned him as one of the three main comparisons to Daeron. Nina writes that, like Daeron, Henry V of England was a young, brilliant warrior king who set out to finish what his ancestor started but never completed. Where Daeron's conquest was Dorne, of course, Henry was looking to make good on his great-grandfather Edward III's claim to the French throne, because back in this era, of course, the French and English thrones were linked within one house or two houses for hundreds of years there. About 300, if I remember correctly. Same length as the Targaryen reign. Within 5 years of renewing the English campaign in France, Henry had won the great victory at Agincourt, the famous Agincourt, made his way to Paris, negotiated a treaty which recognized him as the heir to France under the current King Charles VI and regent. So they had been working for that for something like 80 years and achieved the submission that's very similar to the submission of Sunspear. And now what they had been saying, Henry and his ancestors had been saying that we're kings of France when they weren't. Just like Aegon had been saying we rule the Rhoynar. Like, you don't, but now maybe, sort of true now, but remember the Yellow Toad had dared Rhaenys to bring an army to Dorne? And they did. It didn't go well. She's like, see? We knew we would win if you brought your armies here. This time, that dare, well, he did. Well, he thought he did. He proved it could be done, but didn't prove it could be held. And he lost 10,000 men along the way, which he apparently downplays a bit. May have actually been more. If he downplayed it, but that figure is in his book, then maybe it was 15 or 20. Or maybe he doesn't count how many people were never able to fight again. Sometimes casualties, sometimes you mix dead and injured in the same stat. Injured can be like, you're off your feet for a week. Injured could be permanently crippled, or like you die a year later from wounds that are so severe that you never fully recover. So, yeah. Or
especially in those times, something like losing a foot you can't farm anymore or whatever. Yeah. You might just starve to death. Or
good point. Yeah. So there's a lot of wiggle room. And someone if Daeron is trying to exaggerate the success and reduce the level of failure. This is exactly the sort of thing where that wiggle room exists with casualties,
To be fair, that wouldn't be unique to Daeron.
No, it wouldn't.
Right?
You're right.
Pretty much every leader, every military king, whatever else, they would all do the same thing.
That's true. But they didn't all write it down.
True, yeah.
That makes it, I think, a bigger lie because it's more people are going to believe it. It's going to maybe exist longer. That lie will permeate through the ages. People just, especially as Tyrion noted, people have a reverence in this era, especially for writing. Like, if it's written, it must be true. That's a real world thing, too. Like, newspapers have operated on that principle for a long time. Like, they'll believe it if we write it. At least enough people will. So here's where things started to turn pretty sour. So in 157, the conquest started. The submission was in 158. By 159, he felt it was pacified enough to leave. Here's the quote describing all that.
Is this the King quickly?
Me. No, yeah, it's me.
Okay, sorry.
It's just my mouse is like slow or something today. I don't know. The king quickly consolidated his control of Dorne, dealing with these rebels when he found them, though not without difficulty. In one infamous episode, a poisoned arrow meant for the king was taken instead by his cousin, Prince Aemon, the younger son of Prince Viserys, who had to be sent home by ship to recover. Yet, by 159, the hinterlands were pacified, and the young dragon was free to return in triumph to King's Landing, leaving Lord Tyrell in Dorne to keep the peace. As assurance for Dorne's future loyalty and good behavior, 14 highborn hostages were carried back with him to King's Landing, the sons and daughters of almost all the great houses of Dorne. This tactic proved less effective than Daeron might have hoped, however. Whilst the hostages helped ensure the continued loyalty of their own blood, the king had not anticipated the tenacity of Dorne's small folk, over whom he had no hold. 10,000 men, it is said, died in the battle for Dorne. 40,000 more died over the course of the following 3 years, as common Dornishmen fought on stubbornly against the king's men.
So he declares victory and then loses 4 times more men trying to hold on to it. 40,000, that's probably exaggerated too, right? It was probably more than that. And how many Dornish? We have no idea what the level of Dornish casualties were. Probably around the same level, maybe not, maybe a little lower.
I think a lot less.
Yeah, it might have been a lot less given how hard they were to beat and how well they knew the territory and all that. They would have always been the ones to initiate the fighting, ambushing, things like that most of the time. We don't know what the 14 highborn hostages were, which houses there, but guessing Martell surely, Illyrian probably, Blackmont probably, Dane most likely, Fowler for sure, Gargolin, Jourdain, Manwoody, Corgyle, Toland, Uller, Vaith, Will, and surely Ironwood, because Ironwood's like the second biggest. And we know that Cassella Vaith was one of the hostages because she was one of Aegon the Unworthy's many lovers. So that was certainly one of them. These families would be in power, in a position to assert power over their other vassals and small folk, but as we saw, that wasn't enough. One other maybe misstep Daeron made here was he considered marrying one of his sisters, probably not Dana, who he may have still been considering marrying himself, to the Sea Lord of Braavos in order to help reopen trade with Dorne. Which implies that the Stepstones were not Dornish at this point and were back in pirate hands, because that would be the reason why trade was closed, because of the Stepstones. So this made things worse for him, because at the time, Pentos and Lys were at war with Braavos. So when the king of the Iron Throne is like, maybe I'll marry my sister to Braavos, they're like, uh-oh. So they started helping the Dornish rebels. Let's tie him up there. Let's send soldiers or money to the Dornish rebels. Probably just money and supplies. But whatever forms of aid you can imagine may have passed on as well. Maybe assassination attempts or bribery here and there. Who knows? But those free cities are clever with the way they make war. A lot of times they are indirect, as we saw, subtle, less than just hiring soldiers and sending them to fight. But there were bigger problems for Dorne. Remember what happened again to the last Lord Tyrell to rule. This is probably not a good idea to leave a Lord Tyrell, an aggressive, vindictive Lord Tyrell, when the Tyrells and Reachmen are hated in Dorne. Why would you put this guy in charge? Well, because you're 15 and aren't very wise and experienced as good as you are in tactics. Maybe he's full of himself after his success. He just thinks he can't do any wrong, thinks that all his decisions are golden, not realizing that his administrative decisions are not good, whereas his war decisions may have been. Here's the quote, and a familiar incident, rather.
Lord Tyrell, whom Daeron had left in charge of Dorne, valiantly attempted to quell the fires of rebellion, traveling from castle to castle with each turn of the moon, punishing any supporters of the rebels with the noose, burning down the villages that harbored the outlaws, and so on. But the small folk struck back, and each new day found supplies stolen or destroyed, camps burned, horses killed, and slowly the count of dead soldiers and men-at-arms rose. Killed in the alleyways of Shadow City. I'm going to say it again. Killed in the alleyways of the Shadow City, ambushed amidst the dunes, murdered in their camps. But the true rebellion began when Lord Tyrell and his train traveled to Sandstone, where his lordship was murdered in a bed of scorpions.
Ah, the infamous scorpion bed murder, yes, of course. It may have been Lord Corgyle himself. And you say, well, of course it was. Why wouldn't it have been Lord Corgyle? It was his castle, his murder. The thing is, Lord Corgyle was like the most helpful of the Dornish lords who bent the knee. So either he was being really helpful to set up something like this, which is kind of where I land on the conclusion, or he turned. He was earnestly helping, but then flipped back. After all, look at this thing about Lord Tyrell. It said that it was his custom to turn the lords out of their own beds. Wherever he went to put down rebellions, he would stay the night at their castle and sleep in their room, make them sleep in their own guest room. Like, this guy sounded really overbearing, really haughty, like he was just holding it over everyone. So you could easily see why Korgal would be like, never mind, like, I'm turning on this guy.
I can also see him being maybe like Manderly, right? He's playing the game he's got to play while he's in danger, but he's looking for the opportunity. As soon as he
had the chance, yeah.
Also, look at the bias in this. Valiantly attempted to quell the fires.
Very good point.
Like, is it surprising the Dornish weren't happy with this this conquest? This what's the word I'm looking for? Holding occupation. That's
yeah. And it sounds like Daeron left too soon. Like, Daeron left because he thought it would have been pacified enough. Yet he's traveling from castle to castle with each turn of the moon. Doesn't sound like it was very pacified. Sounds like it was unpacified. Sounds like it was distinctly still in rebellion,
Or I even wonder if Tyrell, maybe it was pacified, but Tyrell just wanted this opportunity to take vengeance against Dornish people, who's going to stop me? We're in charge now. I'll show them.
Maybe his reports were downplaying how bad it was. He wanted to make it seem like he had it under control, but didn't want to get replaced.
I could see all kinds of angles, but...
like Korgal may have... See, here's one of the first things Korgal did, was he helped Tyrell find one of the rebel lords and destroy them. Maybe that guy was just someone Korgal hated. He's like, well, I'm going to use you to take out one of my enemies. And at the same time, it'll make you think I'm your friend, and then I'll turn on you. Yeah, so, I mean, they do have the scorpions on their shield. Do you really want to ally with this? It's just your fault if it's in his, like, what was the scorpion and the toad example? It's like, it's in my nature to sting you. So, yeah, you trusted the scorpion. It's your own fault there, Tyrell. So, again, echoes of Lady Maria. We're not going to bend the knee. We're going to maybe pretend to bend the knee, but this is Dorne. You're not welcome here. You'll never win. Not through violence. And, of course, and this is really what gets me, too. Like, what was Daeron doing back in King's Landing while this guy was valiantly going from castle to castle, kicking lords out of their beds and sleeping with their women? He was writing about his conquest. He wasn't working on how to administer. He was writing his book. Yeah, that's not great. I mean, Nina
could have been great. It would have been. We would look at it differently if things had worked out. If someone in Dorne had managed it better, or if you had a better plan for the aftermath in Dorne in the first place. Writing the book in and of itself isn't necessarily bad, but it's bad relative to how the rest of it went. I real quick wanted to say too, I like the number of people that died down there. It's like that Stalin quote about, 7 people. I don't know how the exact quote, but the idea is, 7 people dying is a tragedy. 7,000 people dying is a statistic. Yeah. It's hard to think of, like, every one of those 40,000 people had a mom and a brother and a cousin and a farm and a life and emotions, and it's all just gone. And it's just hard to imagine the impact of that on society and not just the economy and the families and the farmlands, but the emotions of the family members and the desire for vengeance against Dorne. And I'm sure that's been going on both sides forever, but this is a lot of people all at once dying. And for it to turn out to be almost for nothing, like, it's unbelievable. Like, that's a comparable number of Americans that died in the Revolutionary War. And imagine if just like a year later, England just took back over again. Yeah,
you're right. It is really hard to fathom, and it's surely not something that was in the book. Like, I doubt Daeron read about each one of these people as he didn't put that in the Conquest of Dorne. No, he wouldn't. His kingly view of the world wouldn't allow him to think of those individuals as individuals like that. It probably wouldn't have started the conquest in the first place if he thought about things like that.
And Yandel's clearly not thinking about that,
Yeah.
and is describing all this as valiance.
Yandel's very much won over by this book. The propaganda worked on him, and we have to untangle it to try to get to the truth, I think. And Nina pushes back a little on my idea that he was writing the book back in King's Landing. He may have done a lot of the writing while on campaign, like while the ideas were fresh.
Yeah.
Which is, that's possible. I would think he didn't finish it, though, on campaign. Maybe that's a bit much. But still, she agrees that there's very fair ground to criticize Daeron. Like, even if Lord Tyrell wasn't the right man for the choice to administer Dorne, I mean, we think we could kind of say that kind of from a state of maybe from hindsight, although, frankly, I think it was obvious to begin with. There's nothing stopping him from reversing his decision and appointing someone else to be in charge, but he stuck with Tyrell, and that didn't work. So, the death... go ahead.
Sorry, that's another thing that with dragons, it might have gone better, because the dragons are really good for communication. Right?
Yeah.
Just being able to get messages back and forth, being able to go see these cities that the Tyrell Lord is going to quash rebellions, or the dragon just showing up, but like, I hope things are going okay, by the way. Here I am with my dragon. Don't make me come back,
Yeah, that's true. All right, so here is what happened as a result of his death. It was a big deal. It wasn't just one dead Tyrell. It was the call to start it all back up again.
As word spread of his demise, open rebellion swept Dorne from one end to the other. In 160 AC, the young dragon himself was forced to return to Dorne to put down the rebels. He won several small victories as he fought through the Boneway, while Lord Alan Oakenfist descended once again upon the Planky Town and the Greenblood. Apparently broken, the Dornish men agreed to meet to renew their fealty and discuss terms. But it was treachery and murder they plotted, not peace.
So only one more year later this happened. Just enough time for him to write that book, I guess. And then he has to go back to the campaign, and because he's going to die in this, so the book was clearly done before he left, unless someone else finished it, but there's no indication of that. So they fight all the way back to Sunspear and win. The Dragon Knight, who had been hit by that poisoned arrow, he jumped in front of Daeron to take the poisoned arrow himself. Talk about a true Kingsguard. Like, you can't prove yourself any better than that. He recovered and was part of this campaign. At some point in this campaign, he defeated some unnamed Dornish champion. Well, that's a tantalizing missing detail. Could that have been a Dane? Did he beat, like, the Sword of the Morning? Or did he be, like, a Knight of the Hellholt? In that mush we referred to that happens on Westeros.org, they had it be a Knight of the Hellholt. They called him the Hell Knight, which, of course, you would call him the Hell Knight. It's like, yeah, now that's a foe. The Hell Knight. Yeah, give me that character. But it could have been like an Ironwood, like someone like Archibald Ironwood, or, the guy sent with Quentin Arch with his big hammer. Who knows? There's lots of possibilities that I like thinking about who this Dornish champion could have been. Whoever he was, the Dragon Knight beat him.
Do you think that a normal man would have recovered from the poison necessarily? Do you think it was a Targaryen resistance that made it so that Aemon survived?
Good call. Maybe.
Okay, yeah.
I like that call. That's a very good. He also, if he's jumping in front of the poison arrow, he would hopefully have the wherewithal to put the thickest part of his plate mail in front of it, so it would maybe only a little bit of the poison got him. But I like that idea. Yeah, maybe he's a little extra recovery potential, like +5 Constitution.
Yeah.
+2 poison resistance.
Plus.
But another loss besides this Dornish champion was Lord Cregan, the old man of the north, as in the Cregan Stark we'll see in the Dance of the Dragons. His heir, Rickon, named for Cregan's father, Rickon, dies in one of the final battles of this reconquest of Dorne. So that was a bit of a tragedy. That was a big deal in the north. His loss was felt severely, and it would take he would marry another time, because his second wife, Allie Blackwood, there were daughters only, and he would marry a third time and have more children. And that brought the Starks into the era of Dunk and Egg. All right. The parlay. Here's where the actual assassination happened. Let's talk about that. Here's the quote of the parlay.
In a bloody betrayal, the Dornish attacked the young dragon and his retinue beneath the peace banner. 3 knights of the king's guard were slain, attempting to protect the king. A 4th, to his eternal shame, threw down his sword and yielded. Prince Aemon, the Dragon Knight, was wounded and captured, but not before cutting down 2 of the betrayers. The young dragon himself died with black fire in his hand, surrounded by a dozen enemies.
Oof. If we ever get this scene on television of some kind, it's going to be really something. It's going to be epic. It's going to be probably desperate and not the kind of fight where people are making grand stands. It's probably just grabbing and holding in close quarters and really desperate. Really should be excellent if we ever get it. So the one of the 3 Kingsguard that was killed is the trivia question. The other 2, we don't know who they were. The 4th who threw down his sword, we don't know who that was either. I'm sure that house is glad that we don't know who that is. They're like, yeah, let's not remember him, whoever he was. So that's only 5 Kingsguard. Aemon was captured, and maybe he was captured. That seems like design to use him as a hostage. He's an actual Targaryen, but not the king. So that allows them to have someone to ransom or someone to do something with. And he was also really famous and noble and chivalrous. Maybe they thought he shouldn't be killed because of he was a little outstanding. I don't know. I think it's mostly just a hostage thing, but killing Prince Aemon would have made people even more upset than they were. Not that they weren't really, really upset by this. So, yes, this is an interesting argument here. Does anything go when your country's being invaded? Was this attacking during a peace parlay? Was this kosher? Was this breaking a rule? Is this okay? Like, I go both ways on it. They follow the same religion, both sides here, and a peace banner is supposed to be holy. Like, you're supposed to have, the gods are supposed to be watching over. Like, we wouldn't break the peace that we've ordained the gods are keeping here. So that's the part that I think some people would look at and be like, okay, no, that wasn't okay, because this is an important social convention. Even in war, you have to have parlays that are parlays, even when someone's an invader. On the other side, anything goes. These guys are dirty invaders coming to kill all our people. Like, where do you fall on this, Sean?
I'm kind of torn. That part of me feels like when you're at war, like the plan is to go kill people. So like you're gonna make rules about which people to kill. Like the rule is don't kill people. Once you break that rule, what are the other rules for? But on the other hand, like, how can you ever negotiate for peace or even try if you can't trust that you'll be allowed to do it without being attacked? Also, I think what it really comes down to is who wins. I think the person that wins gets to say if it was okay or not. I think both sides in war invariably break the rules, but the ones that win don't talk about that or justify the rule breaking for the sake of the victory, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think anyone thinks it's correct to kill civilians, but even before the U.S. dropped the nuclear bombs, we were killing tens of thousands of civilians every single night for weeks.
Yeah.
It's hardly talked about that we did that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
it is really tough. I don't think that there's a right answer here. I think that it kind of does depend on how you see it. I mean, arguably by destroying the parlay, they may have set back future parlays. And they're like, well, the Dornish, can they be trusted in the future? On the other hand, do the Dornish care? Like, we don't care. We don't want to parlay with you. You guys are, just aggressive invaders. Like, why should we treat you as equals when you're going to do stuff like this? You need to suggest, well, what's a comparison to the Red Wedding? Is that super different? I'd say it's definitely different but not in some ways. They violated guest right. They also attack their own allies. That's different. When you attack your own allies versus some like maybe he's arguing that, hey, the North were the invaders in the Riverlands. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, they weren't trying to conquer the phrase, but they were kind of forcefully making them into allies. So I don't know. It's an ethical conundrum.
It could be worse too if Lord Tyrell was under a peace banner when he rode into a Dornish lord's home and said, I'm going to sleep in your bed and sleep with your women and eat your food and there's nothing you can do about it. Like, nice peace banner. What does that really mean to us? Yeah. I even thought of that. Like, what if they rode in with a peace banner, then took it down and attacked? Yeah.
How does that work? What's the dynamics of that? Yeah.
Yeah. So like how much can you hide behind that? Were they really there for peace? Are we even sure about that?
Yeah.
Like, Yandel definitely wouldn't tell us if he even knew that there was some plot that they were using a peace banner to sneak in with. So
true that. So what about, and one of the reasons I'm skeptical that they tried to capture Aemon the Dragonknight to give him as a hostage is they didn't give him as a hostage. They hung him in a cage in the Bone Way later and he was rescued, but clearly they weren't trying to get money out of it. They weren't trying to profit. They were just trying to, this is what happens. I guess they wanted to keep him make him torment him. Or the decision was changed along the way, who knows. Anyway, not only was Daeron killed, not only was Aemon captured, but Aemon was wielding Darksister. Daeron was wielding Blackfire, and Daeron was wearing the crown of Aegon the Conqueror. Our episode, The Lost Valyrian Steel, with our good friend Tommy Pappas, delves into this topic a bit. We do know that Blackfire and Darksister turned back up. The crown never did. The crown still hasn't turned up.
Was he actually definitely wearing it at that moment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he wore his crown like Stannis would wear his in battle. Like there's kings that wear their crown to, stand out and be well. Of course, he had his Kingsguard around him at all times. You could kind of tell who he was. He had that distinct gold and black armor, but part of that's the crown. Robb wore his crown most of the time too. So,
I can imagine that he might have had it or carried it with him, but was wearing his helmet in the middle of it. I can also imagine not. I can imagine he wasn't wearing his helmet and he was wearing a stupid crown.
Either way, they got a hold of it, and it's still gone. So, yeah, check out that episode if you want to know what happened to it. We think there's a strong chance it turns back up with young Griff, a.k.a. Fagon, but we'll see about that.
Minor thought, but something else just flashed in my mind thinking about the practicality of a crown.
Clowns in battle, not very practical. Afterwards. Sure.
They should wear the crowns.
The clown.
I wonder how much they were wearing their armor in those hot deserts. And that maybe getting shot by a poison arrow may not have been any armor or as much armor to protect you.
Good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, maybe just chainmail with covers and maybe not as much plate mail.
Even chainmail would be hot. It would be hot. It would soak up the heat of the sun and just burn your skin. And it's the type of thing like in modern armies, it's like it's part of discipline to keep your helmet on. Because it's uncomfortable, it's heavy, and it's hot, and it's uncomfortable, and people really want to take it off, and it's something that kind of has to be enforced to keep your helmet on, right? I can imagine in the desert wearing an armor, even the people who are supposed to enforce that rule might be like, let's just take our armor off. We're going to have heat casualties, and there's not enough water, and we're moving too slow. I can imagine it being a decision that someone at some point says, let's just take the armor off.
It might have been the right decision, not a wrong decision.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Maybe eventually in the middle of the battle, they regret it or they put it back on. But generally speaking, traveling in a caravan through the desert, they probably would have had more casualties from people suffering heat.
Which is why it's so hard to invade Dorne, because if you take your armor off, then you're vulnerable to ambush. You can't put it on when someone's attacking you right there. You need time to put that armor. That's why you have squires, because it's hard to put that armor on. And go ahead.
I bet the Dornish soldiers ambushing, they're probably not wearing plate mail, right? They might have some sort of light leather or cloth or something, but they're moving quick and they're staying cool. And
think of Victarion. It's not as hot in the neck, but he wore his armor day and night because of the poison arrows from the bog devils. So the similar thing is if I take my armor off, this is terrible to wear my armor all the time, but taking it off is worse. And that's why it's so hard to go into these really extreme geographical locations where the locals really know how to use that to their advantage. And the invaders do not.
It's also not exciting writing, but the reality of wearing your armor all the time, think of what a hassle it would be to go to the bathroom. It might be a 30-minute ordeal. You know what I mean?
I can't remember who it was. It said, all knights piss in their armor. Yeah.
I really love in the Stormlight Archive. There's a plot line and a conversation that happens in Brandon Sanderson's The Stormlight Archive where one character is curious and she's talking to a soldier, a man who wears this big armor, and she's like, well, what do you do in battle if you have to use the bathroom? He's like, I shit myself. That's we all shit ourselves. That's straightforward. That's what happens.
It's there's many reasons why battlefields smell bad. That's an underrated reason as part of it. Not only do dead people lose bowels loosen, but the live peoples do as well.
That's another thing that's hard to convey in writing or even in television, that bad odor, which would be constant. You can show one scene or say it one time, but as an audience, you don't continuously keep getting that bad smell that a soldier would.
We need these 4D
can't wait to watch all the battle scenes.
I would put the mute button on the smell-o-vision for that. Yeah. Mute the smell-o-vision. When we're watching the baking show, though, turn that up all the way. Hot Pie's Bakery Extravaganza. That's my new favorite TV show. Yeah, kitchen nightmares with Hot Pie. So let's talk about the aftermath. So of course the conquest was just done then. There was no impetus to continue after that. There was anger towards Dorne. There were calls for revenge, but that wasn't going to happen. Starting off, though, let's discuss a few things and build up to the events that happened. First of all,
King Daeron I's reign was thus 4 short years in length. His ambition had proved too great. Glory may be everlasting, yet it is fleeting as well, soon forgotten in the aftermath of even the most famous of victories, if they lead to greater disasters.
yeah, and he's not alone in this of being a conqueror whose ultimately his legacy was failure, but is still remembered fondly as if he was extremely successful. The Red Kraken's a good example. His victories were cunning and clever and unexpected, and he played the diplomacy game extremely well. He understood the global scenario and where he could press his advantage extremely cunningly, and knew what he could get away with and what he would be punished for, and push those to the extremes. But ultimately, his reign was a massive failure for the Iron Islands. The pushback against him was such that many, many thousands died. There was starvation, yet they remember him fondly. So it isn't just the Targaryens that think this way. The Ironborn do too. Like, this Westeros just loves their heroic warrior leaders who were young. Heck, Red Kraken died at like 21 or something. I forget exactly, but yeah, he was real young as well, maybe 23, but not as young as Daeron, or as Robb, but pretty darn young. His body passed through Cape Wrath. It shows us just how beloved he was in his own time, how tragic this death was for people, especially people who hated the Dornish, like those in the Stormlands, which is where Cape Wrath is. Quote,
Farther south, a broad plain opens up, rolling gently down to the Sea of Dorne, where numerous small fishing villages dot the shoreline. A thriving port and market, the Weeping Town, as it came to be known because it was where the body of the slain hero, King Daeron I Targaryen, returned to his kingdom after his murder in Dorne, stands here, and much of the region's trade passes through its harbor.
Yeah, so the Weeping Town. It's an extremely short moment in the life of this town, but the whole place is named for it just because the dead body of the king was there for a few days. The hero king, it says. Like, Goes to show that's what we're talking about. Yeah, the way he's remembered doesn't line up with our analysis of the man, but hey, that's part of the fun, isn't it? By the way, Weeping Town is where the first version of A Song of Ice and Fire for Mountain Blade, the really, really well-developed mod for that's where you start. You start at the Weeping Town.
Yeah.
Tidbit for you. So there was no marriage and no children, of course, from him. Now, George was once asked in 2008 whether Daeron was gay. And not because there's any evidence of it, just because there's no evidence of his sexuality at all. So whenever you don't know, I mean, hetero is your safest guess, but you could easily be wrong because there's plenty of gay people out there. And when you have an unspecified sexuality, well, it remains possible. George originally had stated that Daeron wasn't gay and had married, but then changed his mind on that. Daeron never did get married. So that doesn't necessarily mean he changed his mind on the other. So it's just an unknown at this point. So he may have been considering marriage. He may have been considering marrying Miriah Martell himself. She ended up marrying Daeron II instead. But she was around then, so that would have been possible. And of course, conquerors marrying a daughter of a defeated foe is extremely standard practice. So we saw that with the Barrow Kings. We saw that with the Stark Kings. We saw that with the Durrandons and the Tarths. Yeah, tons of examples of that. And we saw that with Oris Baratheon and the Durrandon line specifically not too long ago. And maybe he would have been the one to arrange the marriage of Baelor to Dana. Dana was expecting to marry Dana herself, but maybe Daeron had planned on marrying his sister to his brother instead of marrying one of them himself. Who knows? Robb, of course, already had a marriage plan and changed it, and that didn't go well. But with Daeron, we just don't know at this point. So the though it was a bit of tumult, his death caused some tumult. The succession was not tumultuous. More perhaps the decisions his successor made, but really they overall calmed things down. Baelor the Blessed, as weird of a king as he was definitely the right salve for this immediate aftermath. The full story is not something we have time for today, but the first thing he did was deny vehemently the calls to execute the hostages, which was okay. If you need to stop the cycle of violence, good first step. Now, his barefoot walking from King's Landing to Sunspear, maybe that wasn't necessary, but boy, did that have an impact too. Didn't exactly have the same impact on everybody universally, but it was impressive.
Yeah, it wasn't just that he didn't execute them, he returned them.
Mm-hmm. Personally.
On foot through the desert personally, yeah.
It was really something else. Like, maybe we talk about the difference between Tywin and Tytos and Tommen and Joffrey. Talk about opposite. It's hard to be more opposite than this.
Yeah.
That Baelor's like, okay, you came with extreme war. I come with extreme peace. We come in peace. I bring you love. Yeah, so that was Baelor. Perhaps with a little bit of that insanity. But hey, maybe Daeron was a little insane too. Maybe it was kind of a crazy endeavor for both of them.
He might have also gone insane on that trek. He might have been very sane when he set out. But, I don't know, dehydration and trauma through the desert
by
trek
vipers too, apparently, was part of it.
Being poisoned and on, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree. And he may not have been all there in the first place. So yeah, you're right. I mean, this guy was... Some of his decisions became more and more erratic over time, but you're right. Maybe he may have been somewhat sane when this started and it changed over time, but you're right to not assume he was this.
In my headcanon, he was very sane and very intelligent and very brave with this initial decision and trek. That's my take.
Anyone out there is welcome to their own opinion, but I think it's really hard to disagree with the brave part of that. Whoa.
Yeah.
Brave as hell and tough. Yeah, because he did that. He did that. He didn't just set out to do it. He did it.
It is part of why I want to say that he was sane, because I think he might have been less brave if he was insane. If he didn't understand what he was even doing. If he was just crazy, I'm going to go
unable
walk
to process
the desert.
The consequences. Yes.
But if he knew that it would be tough and dangerous and difficult and risky and did it anyway, that's what makes him really brave.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good call. So, as I said earlier, just the fact that this war happened at all is an argument for uniting the kingdoms. Because there had been, and even when before Daeron, Alliandra was approving raids. There were the Vulture Kings and all that. So there was war back and forth, even if it wasn't to this scale. So even though it was an unprovoked assault, it did maybe lead to this permanent peace that lasted for quite a while. Hard to say how things would have gone without this invasion, whether they would have just coexisted for a while or whether there would have been other attempts to marry Dorne or attack Dorne. Who knows? As things went, though, this was part of the process that brought Dorne into the realm. Baelor, obviously super interesting. We'll cover him some other time. Dana the Defiant, would love to learn more about her. She comes up in a lot of places, mostly in our Blackfire episodes. She's the mother of Daemon Blackfire. Rhaena is the next daughter. Or sister, rather, who joined the faith, became a septa. All right, maybe she wasn't as interesting as her two sisters, but the others are super interesting. Triple interesting in Dana's case. And Elena is also triple interesting, the third sister. 7 children, 3 husbands, sat on the small council without actually sitting on the small council. In one of those, like, her husband was a dummy, but everybody knew that she was the person in charge, so if they appointed him, she would make all the decisions, and that's what happened. She also lived a really long life. She might be the most interesting of all of them, but there's a lot of missing details on Dana, so we'll leave that up. So Elena and Dana, very curious about more of them, and more on Baelor, frankly, and heck, Rhaena too, but, And the name Daeron continued to be used for Targaryens quite often. There was, obviously, Daeron II, the most obvious. Then Egg and Betha's third son, Daeron, who was gay. And then there was the second son of Aerys II and Rhaella, who died stillborn. Or not stillborn, but died in the cradle, I guess. And let's talk about how he's remembered. There's a lot of important... I said earlier that he's one of the most cited characters, just in little anecdotes here and there that pop up in ways that you might not even notice. If you were to reread the series starting today, really thinking about Daeron the First, you'd be like, wow, there really are a lot of mentions of him, and it comes up in a lot of different places. Let's have, because he was really beloved by the people. Well, not the Dornish people. They don't have statues of him down there. I would actually like to see that too. How is Daeron the First remembered in Dorne? It's probably very much the opposite of how well he's remembered in Westeros, or in the rest of Westeros. But that's also an open question because we just don't know. Sam 5, A Feast for Crows, is one of our examples right here.
The gates of the citadel were flanked by a pair of towering green sphinxes with the bodies of lions, the wings of eagles, and the tails of serpents. One had a man's face, one a woman's. Just beyond stood Scribe's Hearth, where old-towners came in search of acolytes to write their wills and read their letters. Half a dozen bored scribes sat in open stalls, waiting for some custom. At other stalls, books were being bought and sold. Sam stopped at one that offered maps, and looked over a hand-drawn map of the citadel to ascertain the shortest way to the Seneschal's court. The path divided where the statue of King Daeron I sat astride his tall stone horse, his sword tilted toward Dorne. A seagull was perched on the young dragon's head, and 2 more on the blade.
The dragon must have 3 gulls.
I thought a lot about that moment with the seagulls perched. I never concluded anything, but I felt like it was an interesting detail, and I wondered if there was some symbolic meaning to that.
I wonder too. My best guess is that, yes, there's this great statue here, but like the birds are crapping all over it, and that's really the message here. But also the fact that it's at the Citadel is probably, Nina has a great theory here. It's probably because he wrote the book. Like that he's a scholar king. He's the one that most maybe represents the values of the Citadel in that sense. Obviously the making war is not a value of the Citadel, but writing books is, and they clearly, Yandel loves the book. It's probably very popular at the Citadel in general for some of the reasons Caesar's book is still popular. So that's probably it. But it is noteworthy that this warrior king is celebrated in this city of that's in an area that's supposed to be about knowledge. Like it's right by where all the scrolls and maps and all the scribes and everything are sitting out, and there's King Daeron. So it worked. The book, his book was way more successful than the conquest about it. Let's put it that way. That was his true success. He was remembered, but maybe not for the way he thought he would be, or not for the means he thought.
Yeah. That is interesting too. The idea that there's just birds perched on his sword, like, all right, what good did your sword do? But you're enshrined at the Citadel for the book you wrote.
The book
that's a better legacy, more
enduring,
meaningful.
Yeah, more people would want to talk about that. There's more growth comes from such a thing. Even though it's a book about making war, it's also a book about genealogy and customs and the difference between the Dornish people, which that part is scholarship. Presumably he didn't lie about that stuff. I don't know why he would need to lie about their culture and customs. He might lie about the number of people in the battles, that you can see, but why would he say the Dornish have dark skin in certain places when they don't? Like, that would be a weird thing to lie about. Like, what's the point? So anyway, I somewhat assume that stuff is accurate. Here's another example. Tyrion 5. I almost said Tyrion the 5th. Tyrion 5, because it's in Roman numerals. Tyrion 5, A Storm of Swords. He mentions the book when they are set to Greece, and specifically the genealogies, the different cultures, the 3 types of Dornish people, when they're standing there waiting for Doran Martell to arrive, and oops, Doran doesn't show up, but Oberyn does instead. So that happens. That's a fun one. We don't need to bother quoting that one. It's just Tyrion thinking about the 3 types. He's just idly waiting. So he's like, yeah, in that book that Daeron wrote, there's salty Dornishman sand. He's just thinking, a good way to set that up for the reader. Tyrion's the well-read one, so it fits very well. Then we have this unusual line that comes from Dany IV in A Dance with Dragons.
Skahaz is Kandak, his Darlorak. Your radiance will forgive me, but only one who is not herself Giscari would not understand the difference. Oft have I heard that yours is the blood of Aegon the Conqueror, Jaehaerys the Wise, and Daeron the Dragon. The noble Hisdar is of the blood of Mazdan the Magnificent, Hazrak the Handsome, and Zarak the Liberator.
Oh, Hazrak the Handsome. See, yeah, she's got a point there. Hazrak the Handsome. I mean, don't go against him, let alone Zarak the Liberator. No, but the point here is that it's one of our only example, it may be the only example, of someone outside Westeros, someone who's not extremely favorable to Daeron, Well, there is one or two other examples, but that person is inside Westeros. So someone outside of Westeros referring to this character and how they refer to him. They call him Daeron the Dragon. They didn't say the young dragon. They just said the dragon, which is another reason why it's like this parallel to Aegon, Aegon was called the Dragon. Aegon the Conqueror, Aegon the Dragon, that was like his secondary nickname. The Conqueror was his main nickname, but yeah. So, yeah, that's Daeron the First, not Daeron the Second. So they remember the warrior king and not the one who actually ruled a long time and changed policy and had a much bigger impact on the realm. But the short-lived warrior king, they remember that. Heck, they do remember Jaehaerys, though, so it's not all about the warriors. But they remember it's Aegon and Daeron, and then Jaehaerys, who ruled for by far the longest of any king of Westeros on the Iron Throne. And so here's another one. Yes. And going back to a Game of Thrones, Jon's first chapter, where that first quote about Daeron is, George doesn't want us to forget about that. It's been a long time since he wrote that passage, so he maybe gives us a little clue to keep thinking about that. At Dance with Dragons, Jon 7, quote,
When Jon had been a boy at Winterfell, his hero had been the young dragon, the boy king who had conquered Dorne at the age of 14. Despite his bastard birth, or perhaps because of it, Jon Snow had dreamed of leading men to glory, just as Daeron had, of growing up to be a conqueror. Now he was a man grown, and the wall was his, yet all he had were doubts. He could not even seem to conquer those.
Jon has this...
And I feel Jon gained a little wisdom in the time that passed between that first conversation with Benjen. Yeah,
you are on it now. You really brought your A game today, Sean. Your AA Azor Ahai game now. Jon has the same ancestors as Dany on the dragon side, so he will perhaps one day realize that's his family. Daeron the First is his ancestor, not a direct ancestor since Daeron had no children, but they're same bloodline. Daeron lost a lot of men, as was said. Benjen pointed that out. Jon did overlook that initially. He's maybe not thinking about it as much here, but maybe he should. And Daeron died a few years later, so maybe don't try to be too much like him. Don't get stabbed by... Oh. Too late. But not just Jon getting killed by people he trusts. Let's talk about what you brought up at the beginning, Sean. The Young Wolf. Veteran listeners of History of Westeros will have heard of make this comparison before. It's one of the earliest parallel lives we highlighted, as I said. Number 1. Here's a few examples. Tried to conquer South. Bit of a military prodigy, but also had some talented advisors, right? Like Blackfish was a very talented commander that giving him advice. Oakenfist, ditto for King Daeron. Died with no heirs. Died during a parlay, a meeting that was supposed to be peaceable, like a wedding was supposed to be, violence was to be off limits. So was this parlay. Died with his personal guard all around him. Most of them died as well, with maybe one of them captured. Great John captured versus Prince Aemon captured. There's mention of goat tracks. Remember the goat tracks. Robb evaded the Golden Tooth, the fortress in the west that controls the access point to the west from the Riverlands, and he evaded it using a goat track that Grey Wind found for him. And those goat tracks of Daeron's actually get mentioned in another conversation in A Dance with Dragons by Jon and Stannis. Quote,
When the young dragon conquered Dorne, he used a goat track to bypass the Dornish watchtowers on the Boneway.
I know that tall tale is... Wait, he didn't say tall. I know that tale as well, but Daeron made too much of it in that vainglorious book of his. Ships won that war, not goat tracks. Oakenfist broke the Planky Town and swept halfway up the Greenblood, whilst the main Dornish strength was engaged in the Prince's Pass.
Stannis' take is very interesting. Stannis is a guy who knows the power of fleets. He led the fleet against Victarion. He knows the power of ships. He knows. So I like that quote a lot. Stannis is someone who understands to cut through the BS. He reads the book and just doesn't just take it all to heart. He's like, nah, some of this is exaggerated. Vainglorious book of his.
Yeah.
Stannis is very rational, very sober about the whole thing, where Jon is not.
And much more experienced, much more wise when it comes to the reality of war and battles. He understands what really won that.
Yeah, he's like I said, naval guy. Yeah, so he has the experience to make that judgment, right? Like you say, he knows what he's talking about. And the way Daeron was remembered may reflect the way Robb is and will be remembered. I mean, we're still in that phase. Robb really hasn't been dead that long in the terms of chronology within the books. Even though both of them won, but ultimately lost, they left a huge impact on their followers. The short life, the string of victories, the unlikely insight and capability in war, the dishonorable death. These are things that are remembered. These are things that get sung about, that get written about. Sansa also really cared about the young dragon and Aemon the Dragonknight and Baelor the Blessed. This era really captures a lot of hearts and minds, partly because it's a little more understandable. It's a little more, for people in current times of Westeros, it's a little more similar to their era, because if you go back any farther and there's dragons everywhere, and that's harder to relate to a world with dragons when you live in a world without them. So this was like the first post-Dragon King and era that kicked off that era. So it's more relatable to the current characters.
You know, just real quick, I'm still kind of pondering that Stannis take. I wonder if it's almost a little sad. I bet Stannis had heroes when he was young too. And through his life, they've kind of lost the shine that they had. Kind of like it's happening maybe a little bit with Jon. Maybe it should. Maybe if you grow up with military heroes and you grow up to realize war sucks, maybe you should have had different heroes. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good one. Another parallel besides Robb is one that's kind of ongoing. Young Griff, Fagon. Think of these alarmingly similar quotes. Shout out to, by the way, our good friend Scad over at Davos Fingers. Actually, he's the one that noticed this before I did, if I recall correctly. And if I don't recall correctly, well, shout out to him anyway. Good dude. You have a dragon. He stands before you, says Daeron. What does young Griff say when he's introduced to the Golden Company? I am the only dragon you need. Quote. That's the exact quote. That is a very similar sentiment. And the Golden Company's 10,000
He probably
men.
read that book too.
He may have. Oh, yeah, you're right. They gave him that education.
He's been sort of instructed and prepped for all this. He's certainly read that book.
You are totally right. He definitely read that book. And even though we have no proof he did, I guarantee he did. You're right. Totally did. Same age, warrior-minded, might have a similar length lifespan. And guess where they landed with their armies in the Stormlands as they're invading Westeros? Near the Weeping Town, where young Daeron died, or his body was brought. That's foreshadowing, the ominous kind. I don't expect this kid to live super long either. He might also be the one to turn up with Blackfire and the Conqueror's Crown. That's something we theorize in that other episode, the Lost Valyrian Steel and elsewhere. So more on that if you check out that episode. So definitely bringing those Conqueror vibes back. Not just Aegon, but Daeron I, the young dragon. So young Griff walking in those same footsteps, perhaps, in a lot of similar ways. Unavoidably similar. Similar background, too. All right, last few questions here, our trivia and our outro. Guilty Undertaker says, isn't there a story of Alexander the Great getting around an army with a goat track? There are, I think, multiples of that. He got around one fortress, and I think it was Sogdiana, with these guys were really high up, and they were raining down missiles on his men. They tried many times, and didn't work. But his men found a way to get above the men on the heights. So the guys on the heights were then sort of outflanked from above. And yeah, I think he did use goat tracks and other spots using local guides to get around it. He was very aggressive and energetic. One thing you can say about Alexander the Great, extremely energetic, led from the front, just woke up early every day. I wish I had that much energy, not his aggressiveness, but man, that kind of level of energy this guy had. It's always been, it may have been a tactic, but the night before his great battle, the biggest of the battles he fought against the Persians, he slept in. They had to go wake him up. Who sleeps in on the day? Like, how can you sleep at all before a battle?
Well, he's probably up all night the night before.
He may have been, but still, like, they had to like poke him a bunch of times, like, get up, dude, get up, the battle. But it may have been a tactic to make everyone think he was that confident. He was like, I saw confident. I'm like, I'm so sure we're going to win. I can sleep in. And that confidence, trickles down a bit.
maybe on some level he was that confident. Maybe he had played it out enough times in his head and gone through rehearsals and okay, we got this.
Yeah, it could be both. It could be legitimate, like he may have really been that confident.
Did you just
and
say he had
to...
rehearsals, Sean?
He rehearsed it.
He rehearsed for this. Was Nathan Fielder there, standing ready?
If he was smart, he rehearsed for it.
So I feel like
Nathan Fielder's smart.
Yeah,
so.
he is. He got really good grades at business school. Yeah. I feel like this is the kind of confidence Daeron exuded. Just like, like he was sure of everything. Every decision he made, he's like, we will succeed. And Alexander the Great had that same sort of energy of like, failure? Not an option. I don't understand failure. Andrew Gilbert says, the Spartans were defeated by a goat track. I've read a lot of Spartan history. I don't remember this exact one, but I totally believe you. I'm going to have to go look that up to find out which
I do.
examples.
Yeah, I think that they were betrayed. Like
at the Gates of Fire.
The Persians.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, that totally happened at the Gates of Fire, at Thermopylae. Yes, they were a traitor, led some immortals around to attack their position from behind. Okay, I do remember that now. Thanks for the example. Yeah, good call. Sweet Melissa says, he is called Young Griff. Doesn't end for people who have the young moniker. Young Wolf, Young Dragon, Young Griff. Young Griffin. I mean, that is Young Griffin, right? So it is an animal. You're right. That doesn't bode well. As if there weren't so many ominous things about that boy's future. Here's another one for the pile. Sweet Melissa also says, have fun in Santa Fe and can't wait to hear your interview with George. Looking forward to all the Hot D coverage on the horizon. Us too, Sweet Melissa. Us too. We're all going through this together. It's going to be a blast. The future is bright. TKOK Podcast Network, a.k.a. Tommy Pappas, a.k.a. the same person who joined us for that episode I mentioned, The Lost Valyrian Steel, where we talk about the Crown, Blackfire, Dark Sister, and other missing Valyrian Steel items, sends a super chat, and a bunch of hearts. We heart you too, Tommy. Trivia question was, again, we know Aemon the Dragonknight was one of King Daeron I's Kingsguard. The other, unnamed, remembered in the POV of Aerys Oakheart. Aerys Oakheart remembers his ancestor, Olivar Oakheart, the Green Oak, dying alongside his king, King Daeron I, bravely.
I can also say to you, Z's, multiple people got this one, and multiple people said, keep the questions, the difficulty level you've been doing. They're meant to be a little difficult so that they can ponder it. They like the level.
All right. I'll keep going as we have been. Thank you for the feedback. Mentioned some other episodes. Lost Valyrian Steel, mentioned several times. Our Blackfire series, you can start with Aegon I, the Unworthy, or just go right to Daeron II, the Good, who is has a lot of the parallel here. But really, that era is really interesting and immediately follows this era. So I do recommend that. Next time, no episode on Sunday, but Monday at 6 Eastern. That will be our time for the entire run of House of the Dragon. So after House of the Dragon season is over, we'll be returning to Sundays. But it's so that's Monday at 6 Eastern. Also Saturdays at 3.
With guests.
Yeah. Mondays at 6 with Sean. Saturdays at 3 without Sean and with guests.
And also the other context is that Mondays are our reviews where we have Sean. And Saturdays are our previews where we look at spoilers, because we have spoilers that we don't want to share with Sean.
Right. Exactly. So that should be a lot of fun.
I'm almost certainly going to make some attempts at predictions, and I'm almost certainly going to get spoiled on some stuff down the road.
Yeah,
but our focus will be the episode that we watched and what I construe from that, where I think it's going. Yes. Where Saturday, you can look at like the writings that exist and where you think that's going to go for the next episode.
Yeah.
No doubt. Well,
and we will say we have a few guests lined up already. We will have a couple of the ladies from Direwolf City joining us. We will have Girls Gone Canon joining us for a week. And we will continue teasing those as the season goes on. But just a little idea of some of the guests we'll have.
Some new guests, some returning, some of your favorites, some that will be
And yes, the next stream, Matthew, is a Monday review. Will be Monday, August 22nd, the day after the premiere. But we will also have the George interview being released around the same time. But the next proper live stream will be Monday, August 22nd.
That's right. Thanks to everyone who came to watch live or listen live. Thanks to Nina for a whole bunch of great notes. Check out goodqueenalley.tumblr.com with 1L. Thank you to our patrons who make the show financially viable. We will keep churning out the content. And if you want to get the bonus content, sign up to be a patron or sign up to participate through Spotify. We've got a subscriber-only option there. You could also send a donation through our website. All of those methods get you a whole bunch of bonus content, the best part of which is bonus episodes, but there's other stuff as well. Thanks to Joey, Jesse, Kevin, and Michael for our music and our maps. So good, so great. And, of course, thanks to our mods. Y'all are doing great work over there on Facebook and Discord. I guess the job's about to get a little busier, but in a fun way with more discourse burbling up. We can tell that interest is building based on participation in threads, download numbers, things like that. And, of course, that is exciting for everyone. The more, the merrier. Check out our Threadless shop. We got some cool shirts available, stickers, new logos, new designs. So if you had checked it out before, time to circle back and look again because we've added a lot of new options.
Yeah, and let us know if you order something what color egg you pick. You can choose between rainbow, black and red, cream, blue, pink. Like there's a bunch of choices. So I'm really excited to see what is the most popular egg color. Honestly, like I want to know. I think it'll be the rainbow egg though.
I'm the only one allowed to get the pink one.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, you're the only one allowed to get the pink egg. I did include a pink egg just for Sean Pink of House Beard.
I want to point out, like, we're talking about shirts, that tomorrow is the series finale of Better Call Saul, which I've just become obsessed with, and
Sean
I
is
made
wearing
one video.
a Better Call Saul shirt right now.
Yeah,
to be clear, for all of our listeners, not watchers.
Yeah. Man, I love that show. I really believe it's the best show ever made. And this final season is just even better than I thought it could possibly be. And I'm just obsessing over it so much that I don't think I'm just going to like let it go when it's over. I made one video on YouTube about it already. I think I'm kind of like settling in my mind. I want to just go through every episode.
Do a whole full rewatch.
Yeah,
do a rewatch from the beginning
Yeah.
and just talk about every episode. I think it's so rich and so layered and so, I don't know, so well produced on every level. I'm in awe of it. So.
Well, I encourage you to do that, Sean. And you've got the thing that you most need, which is, like you said, you're really, really, really into it.
Yeah.
That is why
Yeah,
this
yeah.
podcast started, is because we were really, 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 really into A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, and here we are. I mean, 10 years later, it's been a long time, but yeah, that is. I always tell people, if you're going to start a podcast or a YouTube channel, you have to be really into the thing you're doing, because there's going to be a lot of tedium that comes into it, and you have to blow through that tedium, to work through that tedium. It's got to be worth it. You got to really want to have those rewards and have the stuff that you get by going through the tedium. So yeah, you've got that. So yeah, I hope you roll with it.
Yeah, I've been involved on, like, I don't want to spoil stuff, so I've been like in groups. I've been like in Reddit or Facebook groups about it, and I've written. I don't think I'm exaggerating. I think I probably went in tens of thousands of words about this show so far.
Nice, yeah.
I need to get it consolidated and in a better format or better put out there. But yeah, multiple people have said, I can tell your passion just in the way you write about it. So yeah.
It really does. Passion is one of the best things you can have about a project, or just in general. So yeah. Unless your passion is conquering Dorne, that's not so healthy. Literally not so healthy for your army and the people you're trying to conquer. So that's it for today. We will be back, even though next week and for the next several weeks won't be as much about reading. I still encourage you to Valar Rereadis.
Oh, did you not plug Gearby Dragons? Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to give them a plug that they are covering fall-winter preview shows right now. They started, y'all. But now I will say...
they're previews to shows that are coming up?
Andor, House of the Dragon, all that. So if you're excited for a bunch of shows coming out in the next month or two, go join them. And now I get to say Valar Rereadis. And rewatch us, too.